Harlan Pike's man didn't even bother getting off his horse. He rode straight through the gate of the Whitmore ranch like he owned the ground beneath him, reined up in front of 3 hired hands who were mending fence, and dropped a folded paper at their feet. Not handed it, dropped it, like it was something he'd scraped off his boot. "Mr. Pike says you've got 2 weeks, the writer said, not looking at any of them directly. After that, he's filing the water claim whether the widow signs or not. Tell her she can keep the house. He's feeling generous." Then he turned his horse around and rode out the same way he came in, slow, unhurried, like a man who already knew how the story ended. If this story moves you, if you've ever watched someone fight to hold on to what little they had and refuse to quit, subscribe to this channel right now and follow this story all the way to the end. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Don't miss what's coming. It only gets harder and better from here. The cottonwood tree stood at the edge of the Saline Road, about 4 miles outside of Hays, Kansas, and it was the kind of tree that had been there long enough that people had stopped noticing it. Travelers passed it every day without a second glance. It was just a tree-wide trunked, heavy-limbed, leaves turning a dull October gold that nobody admired because October in Kansas was not the kind of month that invited admiration. It was the kind of month that invited you to get where you were going before dark. Elias Mercer had not gotten where he was going. He sat with his back against the bark and his daughter Rose pressed against his left side, her small head resting in the hollow between his shoulder and his chest. She was 7 years old, and she slept the way children sleep when they have nothing left to worry about completely, trustingly, with her mouth slightly open and her fingers curled around the top button of his jacket. She was wearing his coat. He had nothing else to put over her, and the night had come in colder than he'd expected. He was not sleeping. He sat there with his knees drawn up and his eyes moving from the road to the tree line to the road again, the way a man does when he knows he has nothing worth stealing, but also knows the dark doesn't care about that distinction. His hat was pulled low. His hands were cold. He'd eaten the last of their cornbread 2 days ago, split down the middle so the bigger half went to Rose, and he'd told her the smaller piece was all he wanted. She'd believed him. That was the part he couldn't get comfortable with. Not the cold, not the hunger, not even the humiliation of being turned away from 3 separate ranches in the past 2 weeks, each time watching some foreman look him up and down and decide he wasn't worth the risk. He could stomach all of that. What he couldn't stomach was that Rose believed every reassurance he gave her because she was 7 and he was her father, and fathers were supposed to know what they were doing. He pulled her a little closer and stared at the road. The horse, a bay mare named Cora, who was older than she should have been and slower than he needed, stood tied to a low branch a few feet away. She dropped her head. Even the horse was tired. Elias had been working ranches since he was 14. He knew horses, knew cattle, knew how to read weather and fence line and the temperament of a herd that was about to do something stupid. He was not incompetent. He was not lazy. He had references. If the ranches he'd worked at before had bothered to respond to letters which, it turned out, 2 of them hadn't, and the third had burned down in a grass fire the previous spring, which struck him as the kind of luck that followed him specifically. His wife Clara had died of fever when Rose was 3. He'd been working a cattle drive in Colorado when it happened, and by the time the news reached him and he'd ridden back to their rented room in Abilene, Clara had already been buried 2 days. He'd stood at the grave with Rose on his hip. She was too young to understand, but old enough to know something was wrong, which was maybe the worst kind of understanding, and he'd made himself a quiet promise that he would figure it out. 4 years later, he was sitting under a tree in the dark with an empty saddlebag and a sleeping child, and absolutely no plan for the morning. He'd spent the summer working a horse operation outside of Dodge City for a man named Culver, who paid decent and kept his word. But the operation folded in August when Culver's partner absconded with the operating funds, and Elias had been left with 2 weeks of wages and nowhere to apply them. He'd heard there was work north, in the Saline River country. He'd packed Rose and what little they had onto Cora and headed north. There was no work north. Or there was work, but not for a man who showed up with a 7-year-old daughter and no letter of introduction from anyone who was still in business. He understood the calculus. A ranch hired a hand. They were trusting him with their animals, their property, sometimes their safety. An unknown man with a child and no references wasn't a risk most outfits wanted to take. He understood it. He just didn't know what to do about it. The wind moved through the cottonwood and Rose stirred, her fingers tightening on his button without waking. He put his hand over hers. "I know," he said, very quietly, to nobody. "I'm working on it." He wasn't working on it. He was sitting under a tree in the dark. But saying it out loud made the silence a little smaller. He must have dozed at some point, because when he opened his eyes, the sky had changed that particular shade of gray that wasn't quite dark and wasn't yet dawn, the hour when the world looked like a charcoal drawing of itself. The road was empty. Cora had shifted her weight and was watching the tree line. Elias followed the horse's gaze and saw nothing, which meant there probably wasn't anything there, because Cora had better instincts than most ranch dogs, he'd known. Rose was still asleep. He eased her gently off his arm, replaced himself with the folded saddlebag so she'd have something under her head, stood up slowly, and walked 10 paces to the edge of the road to stretch. Every joint in his back registered a formal complaint. He was 29 years old, and he felt 45, which was, he reflected, probably what sleeping on the ground next to your 7-year-old did to a man. He heard the carriage before he saw it. The sound came from the south, the rhythmic double beat of 2 horses working at an easy trot, the creak and roll of iron-rimmed wheels on packed dirt. He stepped back from the road out of habit, not wanting to startle the driver. Most people who traveled before full sunrise were in a hurry and didn't appreciate anything slowing them down. The carriage came around the slight bend in the road, and he saw it clearly in the early gray light. It was a good carriage, not ostentatious, but well-made and well-maintained, the kind that belonged to someone who had money, but didn't feel the need to advertise it with gilt and polish. A driver sat up top, an older man in a brown coat, handling the reins with the practiced ease of someone who'd done it 10,000 times. Inside, and he could see only the outline through the window, a single passenger. He expected the carriage to pass. It slowed. He took another step back, not wanting to appear like he was blocking the road or angling for something. He'd had that look directed at him enough times to know he probably wore a version of it himself, travel-worn clothes, unshaved jaw, the general air of a man who had been sleeping outdoors. The carriage stopped. The driver looked down at him, then past him, to where Rose was still sleeping against the cottonwood. "You all right?" the driver asked. Not accusatory. Just a question. "Fine," Elias said. "We're fine, just resting." There was a pause, and then the carriage door opened from the inside. The woman who stepped down was not what he expected, though he couldn't have said what he expected. She was somewhere in her middle 40s, he guessed, with dark hair threaded with gray, worn pulled back under a travel hat. She was dressed well, but practically, and she moved with the easy competence of someone who had spent a life not waiting for other people to do things for her. She looked at him for a moment, then looked past him at Rose. Her expression didn't change, exactly, but something in it did. "How old?" she said. He turned to follow her gaze. Rose had shifted in her sleep, and the coat had slipped off one shoulder. In the pale morning light, she looked very small against the base of the tree. 7, he said. "How long have you been here? Since last night. Where are you headed?" He took a breath. There was no dignified answer to that question. "Wherever there's work," he said. "I heard there were outfits hiring up this way." Turned out to be less true than advertised. She looked at him steadily. He held it. He was tired and hungry and embarrassed, but he wasn't going to look at the ground. "What kind of work?" she said. "Horses, mostly. Cattle if needed. I've run a breeding operation, worked trail drives, managed a remuda for a spread of 800 head. I know what I'm doing." He paused. "I understand what this looks like. I'm not asking for anything. We'll be on our way. Where will you go?" He didn't answer, because the honest answer was that he didn't know, and he'd found that some truths did more damage than silence. The woman studied him for another moment. Then she looked at Rose again, still sleeping, one small hand resting open on the saddlebag. "My name is Margaret Whitmore," she said. "I own the Double W, about 3 miles east. I need a man who knows horses." She paused. "I'm not in the habit of hiring men I don't know anything about." "That's a reasonable habit," he said. "But I'm also not in the habit of leaving children sleeping under trees." She said it without sentiment, the way someone states a fact they've simply decided to live by. "Come to the ranch. We'll talk. If you're lying about the horses, I'll know it within the hour, and you can go back to wherever you please. If you're not, we'll talk about terms." He stood there for a moment, caught between the part of him that said this was charity dressed up as a business arrangement and the part of him that was staring at his sleeping daughter. The second part won. "All right," he said. She nodded like that was settled, walked back to the carriage and climbed in without further ceremony. He went back to the tree and crouched down beside Rose. "Hey," he said quietly, putting his hand on her shoulder. "Hey, wake up. We're going somewhere." Rose opened her eyes, gray eyes like her mother's, and looked at him with that particular expression she had where she was waking up but hadn't decided yet whether to be worried. "Where?" "A ranch," he said. "Real beds, maybe breakfast." He kept his voice steady. He'd learned not to oversell things. She sat up and rubbed her face with both hands, very seriously, the way she did everything. "Is it far?" "Few miles." She looked at the carriage on the road, then back at him. "Who is that?" "A woman named Mrs. Whitmore. She needs help with horses." Rose considered this. "Can Cora come?" "Yeah," he said. Cora come. That settled, Rose stood up and smoothed her dress, with the focused dignity of a 7-year-old who took her presentation seriously despite sleeping under a tree, and walked toward the road like she'd been expecting a carriage all along. He watched her go and felt something that was almost funny, if you were willing to look at it that way. He untied Cora, checked the cinch, and led her out to the road. The Double W was 3 miles east, and the morning was coming up clear and cold, and Elias Mercer rode behind a stranger's carriage and tried to keep himself from thinking too far ahead. He'd learned that thinking too far ahead was how you built expectations you couldn't afford. He'd take one thing at a time. The ranch resolved out of the flat Kansas morning, like something from a different world than the one he'd been living in. A proper house, 2 stories, with a deep covered porch and windows that caught the early light. Beyond it, a series of barns and corrals, post and rail fencing that was kept up the way good fencing should be, and horses. He could see them from the road, a dozen at least in the near pasture, standing in the morning cool with their heads up, watching the carriage approach. Good horses. He could see it even from distance, the way they carried themselves, the clean lines. Someone had put care into this herd. The driver pulled the carriage around to the front, and a boy of about 15 came running from the barn to take the horses. Margaret Whitmore stepped down before the driver could help her and was already moving toward the house. She paused at the bottom porch step. "Thomas," she called to the boy, "see to his mare as well. And tell Bess we'll breakfast for 3. The boy looked at Elias and Rose with open curiosity and no hostility, which Elias appreciated. "Yes, ma'am." Margaret turned to Elias. "Come inside." He tied Cora to the porch rail, first old habit, always secure your horse, and followed. The inside of the house was warm. A fire already going in the main room, which meant someone had been up before them. The furnishings were solid without being showy. Good wood, good fabric, everything worn in the way that things get worn when they're used and valued, rather than just displayed. He noticed an absence. No photographs, no portraits, the kind of deliberate clearance of a specific person that meant grief rather than indifference. He'd made a similar clearance himself once. "Sit," Margaret said, gesturing toward the kitchen table. She disappeared into the back of the house, and a few moments later a stout woman in her 50s came through from the kitchen. Bess, presumably, who looked at Elias with the measuring eye of a woman who had seen many things come through that door and was prepared to be underwhelmed by most of them. She looked at Rose. Her expression shifted. "Hungry?" she said. Rose looked up at Elias. He nodded. "Yes, ma'am," Rose said. Bess pointed at a chair. "Sit there. I'll have eggs in 10 minutes." Rose sat where she was pointed. Bess disappeared back into the kitchen. The smell of frying salt pork came through the door, and Elias's stomach contracted in a way that was slightly embarrassing. Margaret came back without her travel hat, her hair still pulled back but looser now, and sat across from him at the table with a directness that reminded him of a man he'd once worked for in Colorado. The kind of person who saw no point in approaching a subject from the side when they could walk straight at it. "Tell me about the work you've done," she said. He told her. Not embellished, not minimized the actual record. Where he'd worked, for how long, what his responsibilities had been, what he knew and didn't know. He'd learned that lying in a job interview was a debt that always came due, and he wasn't in a position to take on more debt. She listened without interrupting, which was rarer than people thought. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "Then, my husband died 14 months ago. He built this ranch over 30 years. He knew every horse on this property by temperament, not just by look. Since he's been gone," she stopped, and he saw her choose the next words carefully. The man I had running things knew the cattle side. He didn't have the same feel for the horses. I lost 2 foals this past spring that I shouldn't have lost. I have a stallion cutter who's been difficult since my husband died. I think he knew him, and he doesn't respond well to strangers. She looked at him steadily. That's where I am. What kind of difficult? Elias said. He threw 2 men. Hasn't been handled since April. Can I see him? After breakfast. Bess came in with plates, eggs, salt pork, biscuits, and a small pot of sorghum that Rose immediately identified and reached for. Easy, Elias said quietly. Rose pulled her hand back. Sorry. Bess set the sorghum closer to Rose without comment, which was, in Elias's experience, the highest form of kitchen kindness. They ate. He ate slower than he wanted to because he didn't want to look desperate, which was a small and possibly stupid pride, but it was the pride he had. Rose ate with focused attention, the way she always ate when she hadn't eaten in a while, steadily, quietly, cleaning her plate. He watched Margaret across the table. She ate like someone who was thinking about something else, which probably meant she was thinking about him. He didn't blame her. He'd think about him too. After breakfast, she took him to the barn. Cutter was in the last stall, a big gray stallion, 16 hands at least, with a white blaze and eyes that had a particular quality he recognized immediately. Not mean. Scared. There was a difference, and most people missed it. A mean horse wanted to hurt you. A scared horse would hurt you, trying to get away from something it thought was going to hurt it first. He stood at the stall door and looked at the horse. The horse looked at him. Don't open it yet, Margaret said from behind him. I'm not going to, he said. He wasn't even close to opening it. He was just standing there. He put his hands in his pockets, a deliberate move, making himself look smaller, less purposeful, and let his gaze go slightly unfocused, not staring directly at the horse, just being present in the general area. Cutter's ears, which had been pinned back, shifted. Not forward, but not flat. You stand there and do nothing for a reason, Margaret said. He needs to know I'm not coming for him, Elias said. Most people walk up to a horse like they're going to do something to it. He's been expecting that for months. I'm just standing here. And that works? Eventually. He stood there for another 4 minutes. He counted, roughly. At the end of 4 minutes, Cutter had moved 3 steps toward the door of his own accord. All right, Margaret said quietly, and something in her voice told him he'd answered the question he'd needed to answer. He turned away from the stall, important to leave on his own terms, let the horse think about it, and walked back out of the barn to where she was standing. What are your terms? He said. She looked at him for a moment. Room and board for both of you. $15 a month to start, $25 if you prove out in the first 30 days. It wasn't much, it was more than nothing, which was what he had. The room Rose would have a proper bed? There's a hand's quarters off the west end of the house. 2 rooms. It's not grand. She's been sleeping under a tree, he said. Grand is not the benchmark. Something crossed Margaret's face, not pity, he was relieved to note. Something more like recognition. All right then, she said. One condition, he said. She raised an eyebrow. I do the work and I do it right. I don't take wages for work I haven't done. If there's something I can't do, I'll tell you before I try it, not after. And if something's wrong with the operation, with how things are being run, I'll say so. I won't just agree to keep the position. He met her eyes. I understand that's not what most people want from hired help. No, she said. It isn't. She studied him. I'll make an exception. He nodded. They did not shake hands. She turned back toward the house, and he stood in the barn lot and took one slow breath and let himself feel, just for a moment, something he hadn't felt in 3 months. Not gratitude exactly. Footing, like he'd found a ledge to stand on. He went back inside to tell Rose. She was at the kitchen table with a piece of biscuit and the sorghum pot. And when he came in, she looked up with that expression, the one that was trying not to ask the question, because she'd learned not to get too hopeful about things. We've got a place, he said. Her face did something complicated, and then she went back to her biscuit as if this were expected, which was her way of covering the fact that she was extremely relieved. He'd learned to read it over 4 years of raising her alone. Is there a barn cat? She said. I didn't ask. There should be a barn cat, she said seriously. Every barn should have a cat. I'll put it on the list, he said. Bess appeared in the kitchen doorway, looked at both of them, and turned around without speaking. Through the kitchen window, Elias caught a glimpse of her shoulders shaking in a way that might have been a laugh. He settled Rose into the 2 rooms off the west wing by mid-morning, sparse but solid, a rope bed that had a real mattress, a chest of drawers, a small wood stove that he got going in 20 minutes. Rose walked through both rooms very slowly, touching things with careful fingers, like she was making an inventory. She looked at the bed for a long time. "You can sleep in it," he said. "That's what it's for." "I know," she said, still looking at it. Then she sat on the edge and bounced once, experimentally. He went back out to earn his wages. The first day, he asked permission for nothing and explained nothing. He just walked the operation, the barns, the corrals, the pastures, the fence lines. He watched the hands work. He counted horses, noted condition, watched how the animals moved and what they avoided and what they sought. He kept his mouth shut, which was a discipline, because there were things he saw in the first 2 hours that he would have done differently. But he was the new man. A new man who talked too fast lost everything before he proved anything. By the end of the afternoon, he'd identified 3 things that needed immediate attention: a water trough in the south corral that had a slow leak and was sitting lower than it looked, a mare in the east pasture who was favoring her left fore and had been for at least a week by the wear pattern in the grass where she'd been standing, and a section of fence along the north edge that had been repaired with the wrong gauge wire, which would hold until it didn't, and then it would fail all at once. He reported to Margaret at supper not as complaints, just as facts. She listened. Then she turned to the man who'd been running the horses, a weathered hand named Gruber who'd been with the ranch for 6 years and was not visibly happy about Elias's presence at the table. "You see the mare?" she said. Gruber's jaw tightened. "She's been a little off. For how long?" Silence. "Gruber, week and a half," he said. "I figured she'd work it out." Margaret set down her fork. "A week and a half." She said it without volume, which was worse than if she'd said it loudly. "We lost 2 foals this spring, and you let a mare stand lame for a week and a half. She's not lame. I'll look at her in the morning," Elias said. He kept his voice neutral, not taking sides, not driving the wedge in deeper than he needed to. He didn't want an enemy in Gruber. He wanted a colleague who understood the new arrangement. Whether he'd get that was a different question. That night, after Rose was in bed, she'd fallen asleep in about 3 minutes, face down on the real mattress with her arms at her sides, the absolute sleep of someone who had not been comfortable in a very long time. He sat on the step outside their door and looked at the ranch in the dark. The horses were dark shapes in the near pasture. Cutter's barn was quiet. He could hear the wind in the grass and the distant sound of coyotes, and he sat there until he got cold enough that it seemed pointless to stay out, and then he went inside and slept. He did not have any particular plan, beyond what he'd said to Margaret: do the work right, say what needed saying, don't lie about what he didn't know. It wasn't much of a plan. But the mare's leg, when he looked at it the next morning, turned out to be a stone bruise deep in the hoof wall, uncomfortable but not permanently damaging, and catchable if someone had been watching closely. He cleaned it, packed it, showed Gruber what to look for. Gruber said nothing, but he looked. And in the stall at the end of the barn, a big gray stallion stood with his ears tipped forward, watching the new man work. That was something. Not much, but something. The stone bruise healed in 11 days. Elias packed it every morning and every evening, and on the 12th day the mare walked out of the stall clean and even, and he watched her move across the corral with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had done something correctly. Not triumphantly, just correctly. There was a difference, and it mattered to him. Gruber watched from the fence rail. He didn't say anything, but his jaw had a different set to it than it had the week before, not hostile exactly. More like a man reconsidering a position he'd already committed to out loud, which was an uncomfortable place to be. Elias didn't push it. He'd learned that some things only moved at their own pace. He'd been at the Double W for 3 weeks, and the shape of the days had settled into something he could work within. Up before light, horses first water, feed, a walk of the pastures to check for anything that had changed overnight. Then whatever the morning brought. Fence work, tack repair, the slow, careful business of reacquainting Cutter with the idea that human hands were not inherently a threat. Evenings he wrote a brief accounting of the day's work in a small notebook Margaret had given him, not because she asked for it, but because he'd decided it was the professional thing to do, a record she could look at and understand exactly what she was paying for. She read it. He could tell because sometimes at supper she'd ask a question about something he'd written, not testing him, just following the thread. Rose had found the barn cat. There were actually 2 of them, a gray tom named, according to young Thomas, Duke, and a smaller black one with no name that apparently predated Thomas's employment and had declined to be given one. Rose had named her Needle, on the grounds that she was thin and sharp, which Elias thought was either perceptive or alarming, and possibly both. Rose had also, in the way that 7-year-olds do when they are no longer worried about where they're sleeping, begun to take up space. She followed Bess in the kitchen with solemn attention, learning the sequence of things. She sat on the fence rail and watched Elias work the horses, asking questions at a rate that he suspected would have driven most adults to distraction, but which he'd long since learned to treat as a feature rather than a problem. She was, by his observation, conducting a comprehensive survey of everything on the ranch, and would eventually get to a conclusion about it. The conclusion he'd been bracing for arrived on a Thursday evening. "I like it here," Rose said. She was sitting across from him at the small table in their quarters, working on a piece of arithmetic that Bess had set for her, because Bess had apparently decided that a 7-year-old with no schooling was an affront to the natural order, and had taken it upon herself to address it. "Good," he said. "Can we stay?" He looked at his hands, which were resting on the table. His knuckles were scraped from a fence post that had argued with him that afternoon. "That depends on a lot of things," he said. "Like what?" "Like whether I do my job well enough that Mrs. Whitmore keeps wanting me to." Rose absorbed this. "Do you?" "I think so," he said. "Is that enough?" He thought about it. "Usually," he said. "Most of the time. Doing something well is usually enough." He said it with more confidence than he felt, which was, he was beginning to understand, a significant part of the job of being a father. The first real test came on a Saturday morning, 3.5 weeks after he'd arrived. It started with noise, a sound from the breeding barn that he identified before he was fully awake, a heavy rhythmic crashing that meant a large animal, in a confined space, was trying to make the space larger. He was out of bed, and moving before the thought had fully formed, pulling on his boots in the dark, going out the door into the cold morning air. The breeding barn lights were already lit. Someone had gotten there before him, and when he came through the main door, he stopped for exactly 1 second to read the situation before doing anything. Cutter was loose in the main corridor. He'd gotten out of his stall the latch, it would turn out later, had been defective for months, and no one had caught it, and was now caught between the entrance and the far wall, spinning and crashing, hooves striking the boards with a sound that was doing nothing good for the other horses in the barn. 3 hands were in the corridor, trying to manage him, which was the wrong approach. 3 men in a narrow space, with a panicked 16-hand stallion, was not management. It was just more chaos. One of the hands, a young man named Fletcher, who'd been with the ranch about 2 months, had gotten himself backed into a corner, and was trying to shield himself with a lead rope that was doing nothing. Gruber was in the middle of it, which Elias could see was well-intentioned and completely counterproductive, because Gruber kept trying to approach the horse directly, and the horse kept responding to that approach by spinning away and crashing into something else. Elias stood still in the doorway. "Get out," he said. Not loudly, almost conversationally, but in a barn where everyone was already paying close attention, it carried. Gruber turned to look at him. "He'll destroy the minutes." "I know. Get out. All 3 of you, out of the corridor, into the stalls or out the door right now." There was a half-second where Gruber's authority and Elias's instruction were in direct competition, and Elias watched the older man work through it. Then Gruber stepped back into an empty stall and pulled the door shut. The other 2 followed. The corridor was suddenly just Elias and Cutter. The stallion had stopped spinning. The removal of 3 bodies from his immediate space had changed the calculation. He stood at the far end of the corridor, blowing hard, his eyes white-rimmed, his weight on his hindquarters like he was ready to go in any direction. Elias took 3 slow steps forward and stopped. Cutter's head came up. Elias looked at the wall, not at the horse, at a knot in the wood about 4 feet to the left of where Cutter was standing, and he let his shoulders drop and breathed slowly and did absolutely nothing. The barn was quiet except for the sound of the other horses, shifting, nervous, reading whatever Cutter was doing. Elias could hear his own heartbeat. He made a conscious effort to slow it, which didn't work exactly the way people thought it did. You couldn't actually slow your heartbeat by thinking about it, but the effort of trying Sloane's his breathing, and his breathing was the thing the horse could read. 40 seconds. Cutter blew out a long breath. His head dropped 2 inches. Elias took another step, and this time he made a small sound, not a word, just a low, steady exhale, the kind of sound that meant nothing threatening. the kind of sound a horse might make to another horse. He'd learned it from an old horseman in Colorado who'd had a voice that could reach into a panicked animal and find the place where calm lived, and Elias had spent years trying to replicate it. He was never sure he'd gotten it right. But Cutter took a step toward him. It was small, less than a foot, and it was hesitant, and the horse's whole body was still coiled and ready to reverse, but it was toward him, and that was the only direction that mattered. Elias stood still and let it happen. 2 more steps. 3. Then Cutter was close enough that Elias could have reached out and touched his nose, which he didn't do. He just stood there, and after another 30 seconds, the stallion dropped his head the rest of the way and touched his muzzle, very lightly, against the side of Elias's arm. He put his hand on the horse's neck, then flat-palmed, steady, no grabbing, no urgency, and the horse stayed. "Okay," he said quietly. "All right." He heard the stall door open and Gruber come out slowly. The other men followed. He could feel them watching from behind him, and he was aware of something he hadn't fully anticipated. This was the kind of moment that traveled. Word would spread, not because he'd planned it, but because people told stories. And a man who walked into a corridor alone with a panicked stallion and brought him down by doing almost nothing was a story worth telling. He didn't particularly want to be a story. He just wanted the horse safe. He led Cutter back to his stall, checked the latch, it was loose at the bolt, a 10-minute fix with the right tool, and stood at the door while the horse settled. When he came out, Gruber was waiting. "That latch," Elias said before Gruber could speak. "It's been working loose for a while. I should have caught it sooner." He meant it. He'd noticed the stall was in the section he'd been getting to last on his morning rounds. Gruber looked at him. His expression was complicated, not grateful, not hostile. Somewhere in the middle where a proud man ends up when he's seen something he can't argue with. "Where'd you learn that?" "Colorado," Elias said. "Old man named Harker. He could do it better. But he showed me the idea." "The idea being what, exactly?" "Horse isn't trying to hurt you," Elias said. "He's trying to get somewhere safe. You figure out where that is and you go there first." Gruber chewed on that for a moment. "Sounds simple." "Everything sounds simple," Elias said. Gruber almost smiled. "Didn't. Quite. But almost." Margaret was on the porch when he came out of the barn. She'd heard the noise and come out, which he'd expected. She was not the kind of woman who waited in the house while things were happening. She was wearing a coat thrown over her nightclothes, and her hair was loose, which he registered and then deliberately did not think about further. "Cutter," she said, back in his stall. "Latch failed. I'll fix it today." "Is he hurt?" "No. He's rattled, but he's not hurt." He paused. 3 of the boards in the corridor need replacing. He kicked them pretty good. "Are you hurt?" The question caught him slightly off guard. Not because it was unusual, it was a reasonable question, but because of the way she asked it, direct and without preamble, looking at him rather than past him. "No," he said. She nodded, looked at the barn for a moment, then looked back at him. "You went in there alone. 3 men in that space was making it worse. You still went in alone. Seemed like the right call." She held his gaze for a moment longer than was strictly necessary for an employer confirming a decision her employee had made. Then she pulled her coat tighter. $25 starting this month, she said. "You've proven out." She went back inside without waiting for his response, which he was grateful for, because he wasn't sure what his response would have been, and he preferred not to find out in the cold at 6 in the morning. He went to find his tools. The news of the Cutter incident spread in the way these things always spread in ranch country. By noon, everyone on the property knew it, and by the following Monday, it had reached town, slightly improved in the telling. He heard a version of it from Thomas that involved a horse twice Cutter's actual size, and an implication that Elias had done something mystical, which was not accurate, but also not worth correcting. What it did do, what he hadn't fully accounted for, was change the quality of attention he got in town. He went in every week or two for supplies, sometimes with Thomas, sometimes alone. The town of Hayes was not large, and the Double W was well known, and people had already noticed that Margaret Whitmore had taken on a new hand. They noticed, and some of them had formed opinions, and the opinions were not uniformly favorable. He became aware of it the first time he went to the feed merchant after the Cutter story had circulated. The merchant, a man named Odell, was polite, the kind of polite that has thought about being less polite and decided against it on business grounds and passed along, with the supplies, a piece of information that he delivered with the careful neutrality of a man who wanted to inform without appearing to instigate. Mrs. Whitmore's relatives were in town day before yesterday, Odell said, counting out change. Her husband's cousins. From the Lawrence branch. I don't know them, Elias said. No, but they know about you. Odell set the change on the counter between them, rather than placing it in his hand, which told Elias something. They were asking questions about your background, employment history, that kind of thing. What kind of questions? The kind a man asks when he's worried about someone moving into a situation he considers his own business. Elias picked up the change. Appreciate you telling me. Just information, Odell said. Just information, right. He drove back to the ranch and thought about it. He understood what it looked like from the outside. A widow of means, property worth considerable money, and a penniless stranger she'd picked up off the road, who was now living on her land, eating her food, drawing her wages. From the outside, that looked like opportunity presenting itself in the shape of a man. It bothered him more than he expected, because he'd been so careful about exactly that, about not overstepping, not presuming, keeping the line between professional and personal as clear as a fence rail. He was her employee. She was his employer. That was the whole of it. But the problem with lines was that other people could draw them differently. He said nothing to Margaret about the relatives. It wasn't his business to manage, and he didn't want her to think he was anxious about it, which he was, slightly, but only because he didn't want his presence to cause her problems. He was already aware, in a way he hadn't quite put language to, that he didn't want to leave. That was a new feeling, and he treated it carefully, the way you treat something that might be delicate or might be dangerous, and you haven't figured out which yet. The relatives arrived on a Wednesday. There were 3 of them, a man named Gerald Whitmore, who was her late husband's first cousin, his wife Dorothea, and a younger man, who was introduced as their son Warren. Gerald was in his mid-50s, well-dressed without being extravagant, and had the manner of a man who was accustomed to being listened to and had decided in advance of this visit that he would say several things that needed saying. Elias saw them arrive from the North Corral, where he was working with a 2-year-old filly who needed to get comfortable with a rider's weight before she'd be useful for anything. He watched the buggy come in, watched Margaret come out to greet them, and went back to the filly. He heard about the visit from Rose, who had heard it from Bess, who had been in the kitchen and had a clear line of sound to the sitting room where Gerald Whitmore had conducted his conversation with Margaret. The man said you were suspicious, Rose said. She was sitting on the fence rail watching him work, in the position she'd taken to occupying most afternoons. He said she was being foolish. Rose, that's what Bess said, he said. It's not our business. He said you were after her money. She said it the way a child says something they've heard adults say, with a kind of careful pronunciation that meant she wasn't entirely sure what it meant, but knew it was important. Elias kept his attention on the filly. People say things, he said. It doesn't change what's true. Rose thought about this. What is true? That I work here, that's all. She was quiet for a moment. Then, do you like her? He felt the question land somewhere between his ribs. Mrs. Whitmore is a fair employer, he said. Rose gave him the look she had, the one that suggested she found this answer technically accurate and fundamentally evasive. She'd been giving him that look since she was 5. He'd never gotten used to it. Go help Bess, he said. Bess said I asked too many questions. She's right. Rose climbed off the fence rail and went toward the house, and Elias went back to the filly and did not think about the question. He did not think about it very successfully. Margaret said nothing to him about the visit until that evening, when she came to the barn while he was doing the last check of the day. He heard her come in and didn't turn around. My husband's cousin thinks I've lost my mind, she said. So I've heard. He kept his eyes on Cutter's stall. The horse had been better the last few days, not friendly exactly, but no longer treating Elias's presence as an emergency. He thinks you're positioning yourself to, she stopped. He was quite specific about what he thinks you're positioning yourself for. I imagine he was. She came up beside him, and for a moment they both looked at the horse in silence. Are you? She said. Her voice was even. This was not an accusation. It was a direct question from a direct woman, and he owed it a direct answer. No, he said. He said a man in your position would naturally. Mrs. Whitmore. He turned to look at her. I was sleeping under a tree with my daughter because I couldn't find work. You gave me work. I am grateful for it. That's the whole of what I feel about this arrangement, and if that becomes untrue at some point, I'll tell you before I do anything about it. He held her gaze. Is that clear enough? She looked at him for a moment. It is, she said. Good. Gerald also told me I should let you go, as a precaution. What did you tell him? I told him that Cutter had let you put a lead rope on him yesterday morning, which is more than any man on this property has managed in 8 months, and that if he'd like to find someone else to do that job, he was welcome to look. She paused. He didn't find the humor in it. Did you mean it humorously? Not particularly, she said. But it was the right answer. She left, and he stood in the barn alone with the horse for a little while longer, and the horse looked at him with those large, dark eyes that were less wild than they'd been a month ago, and Elias thought about the shape of the situation he was in. It was not a simple shape, but then he reflected, nothing worth anything ever was. The relatives stayed 4 days, which was 3 days longer than Elias would have preferred, and during that time he was scrupulously careful professional, invisible where possible, never in a room with Margaret if one of the 3 Whitmore cousins was also in it. He ate his meals in the quarters with Rose, did his work, and kept his opinions to himself. He was very nearly successful. On the 3rd day, coming back from the south pasture at mid-afternoon, he rounded the corner of the main barn and nearly walked into Warren Whitmore, the son, who was apparently waiting for exactly that. Warren was about 25, soft in the way of a man who'd never needed to be otherwise, with his father set to his jaw, and none of the intelligence that sometimes accompanied that particular jaw. He looked at Elias with an expression that was trying to be contemptuous and landing somewhere closer to nervous, which told Elias that this conversation had been planned and rehearsed, and the plan was already not going the way it was supposed to. I want to talk to you, Warren said. I can see that, Elias said. He stopped, because walking past the man seemed unnecessarily rude, and he was trying, with moderate success, to keep the situation from becoming worse. You need to understand something, Warren said. This ranch, everything Margaret has, it belongs in the family. Whatever you think you're doing here, I'm doing my job, Elias said. Whatever angle you're working, I don't have an angle. He kept his voice level. I work the horses. That's what I was hired to do. Warren stepped closer, which was a mistake on his part, because it put him in a space where Elias's height and the difference in their respective physical conditions became somewhat more apparent. Warren seemed to realize this mid-step and stopped. My aunt is alone, Warren said. She's vulnerable. People take advantage of that. Some people, Elias agreed. I'm not one of them. How would I know that? You wouldn't, Elias said. That's a fair point. You don't know me. So watch what I do, and when you've watched long enough to form an opinion based on what actually happens rather than what you imagine might happen, then we can have this conversation. He held Warren's gaze. Until then, I have work to do. He walked past him. He heard Warren say something behind him not loud enough to be addressed, possibly not intended to be. He let it go. That evening, he was in the tack room when he heard Rose outside the door, talking to someone. He recognized Bess's voice, and then Margaret's, and he heard Rose say, with the precision she brought to all of her more important statements, "My father doesn't want anything from Mrs. Whitmore. He just wants to do good work, he said so." There was a pause, and then he heard Margaret's voice, quieter, and he couldn't make out the words. He stayed in the tack room until the conversation had moved on, and then he stayed another 10 minutes after that, doing things with the harness leather that didn't strictly need doing. The relatives left Thursday morning, and the ranch was immediately, noticeably quieter. He was fixing the corral gate when Gerald Whitmore came to find him before the buggy left. The older man walked across the lot with the deliberate step of someone delivering a final word. I want you to know, Gerald said, that I intend to keep an eye on this situation. Elias looked up from the gate hardware. All right, he said. If you're the man you appear to be, that won't matter. It won't matter either way, Elias said, because I'm going to do the same thing whether you're watching or not. That's how I work. Gerald studied him. Something in his expression shifted slightly, not approval exactly, but the narrowing of disapproval that occurs when a man realizes the object of his concern is more complicated than his concern account for. See that you do, Gerald said. He walked back to the buggy. Elias went back to the gate. That afternoon, a Friday, cool and dry, the kind of Kansas afternoon that felt like an apology for August, he got Cutter out of the stall with a lead rope for the first time. Not into the corral, not yet. Just out into the barn corridor and then back. 18 minutes total. The horse was tense the whole time, but he did it. He went where the rope asked him to go. Margaret was in the barn when they came back. She'd come in quietly and was standing at the far end near the tack room door, watching. He didn't acknowledge her, directly, Acknowledging her would have broken the horse's attention, and when he had cut her back in the stall saw and the latch secured, he turned around. 2 more weeks, he said, and he'll go to the corral. She nodded slowly. My husband used to say that horse understood more than was good for him. She was quiet for a moment. I think he was right. Most horses do, Elias said. That's the whole problem. She looked at him the look she had sometimes, assessing, direct, without pretense. You're good with him, she said. He's a good horse. He just had a bad year. She turned that over for a moment, and he had the distinct impression she was hearing something in it, beyond the subject of the horse. Which was, he decided, accurate. Which was, also he decided, not something he was going to address out loud. Supper's in an hour, she said, and left. He turned back to Cutter's stall. The stallion was watching him over the door, with his ears up and his eyes calm, which was different from 3 weeks ago, in a way that was measurable if you'd been paying attention. Don't look at me like that, Elias said. The horse flicked an ear. He went to wash up for supper, and Rose was at the kitchen table already, working on something Bess had set her to, and Needle the cat was on the windowsill, and the smell of whatever Bess was cooking was the smell of a house that was being lived in. And Elias Mercer stood in the doorway for a moment before he went inside. He told himself it was nothing. He'd been telling himself that for about 2 weeks now, with decreasing conviction. Cutter went to the corral on a Tuesday, exactly 16 days after Elias had first walked him down the corridor on a lead rope. It was not a triumphant occasion. The horse came out tense, his neck high and his steps short, reading everything around him like a man walking into a room where he'd once been hurt. Elias kept the rope loose. Tension on the line was just another thing to fight against, and he wasn't interested in fighting, and walked him around the perimeter of the corral twice, then brought him to the center and stood with him until the horse's breathing slowed and his weight settled back onto all 4 feet equally instead of being loaded forward the way a coiled spring loads. It took 40 minutes. At the end of it, Elias unclipped the lead rope and stepped back, and Cutter stood in the middle of the corral for about 10 seconds, like he didn't know what to do with the freedom. Then he walked to the far rail, dropped his head, and found a patch of dry grass to nose at. Thomas was sitting on the top rail watching. That's it, he said. That's it, Elias said. Seems like it should be more. Most things that work don't look like much, Elias said. That's how you know they're working. Thomas thought about this with the expression of someone who suspected they'd been told something true, but couldn't figure out where to file it. Gruber had been watching from the barn door. He didn't say anything when Elias came back through, just moved aside and went back to what he'd been doing. But 2 days later, without being asked, he replaced the worn lead rope on Cutter's hook with a new one from the supply room, and that, in Elias's experience, was how a certain kind of man said what he thought. It was now 7 weeks since the cottonwood tree. The ranch ran differently than it had when he'd arrived, and he was aware that this was both good and potentially complicated. Good because the horses were healthier, the operation was tighter, and Cutter, who had been the most expensive and least usable animal on the property, was beginning to move like the breeding stallion he was supposed to be. Complicated because people noticed change, and when they noticed it, they formed opinions about who had caused it, and opinions were the kind of thing that traveled to places you hadn't sent them. The whispers in town had shifted slightly in register. It was no longer simply that the widow had taken in a penniless drifter. Now it was that the penniless drifter had made himself indispensable, which was either admirable or suspicious, depending on who was doing the talking. He knew this because Bess told him, and Bess knew everything that moved through Hayes on the current of social exchange, which was a powerful current in a town that size. People are saying she's going soft, Bess said one morning, not looking up from the bread she was working. That she's letting sentiment cloud her business judgment. She hasn't done anything sentimental, Elias said. He was at the table with coffee, going over the notebook, before the day started. She made a business decision. The ranch is in better shape than it was. I know that, Bess said. You know that. But people don't talk about what they know. They talk about what they can see. And what they can see is that Margaret Whitmore brought home a man she found sleeping on the road. She brought home a ranch hand. Bess finally looked up. She had a way of looking at him level, patient, slightly exasperated, that reminded him uncomfortably of his own grandmother, Elias. I've worked for this family for 11 years. I've watched half the county try to figure out what Margaret Whitmore is going to do next since the day she married John, and every last one of them has underestimated her at least once. She paused. I'm telling you what people are saying. Not because I agree with it, but because you should know what's in the air. Things are starting to move around here in ways that go beyond just the horses. He looked at her. What kind of ways? Harlan Pike kind of ways, she said, and went back to her bread. He'd heard the name. Pike came up in conversation, the way certain weather came up as a condition you couldn't change but needed to account for. He owned the Double P, the largest cattle operation in the county, and the Double P's northern boundary ran along the Double W's eastern fence line for about 3 miles. The relationship between the two ranches had been formally civil and functionally hostile for years, according to Gruber, because Pike had wanted the Double W's water, a spring-fed creek that ran through the northeast corner of the property and fed a series of stock tanks that kept the land useful in dry years, and John Whitmore had declined to sell it at any price. John Whitmore was gone now, and Harlan Pike had apparently decided that a widow was a different proposition than her husband. Elias had not met Pike. He'd seen him once at a distance in town, a broad man on a gray horse, the kind of man who occupied more space than his physical size accounted for, with the unhurried movement of someone who had decided long ago that other people would wait for him. He mentioned the name to Margaret that evening. She was at the desk in the ranch office, going over the account ledgers, which she did every Friday without delegation, because she didn't trust anyone else to interpret what the numbers meant in combination. He knocked on the door frame. The door was open, which meant she was available, versus closed, which meant she wasn't. "Come in," she said, not looking up. "Bess said Pike's name this morning," he said. I didn't want to ask in front of her. Margaret set down her pen. "What did she say specifically?" "That things were moving in Pike kind of ways." He paused. "I don't know what that means yet, but I've learned to take Bess seriously." Margaret folded her hands on the desk. She had the look she got when she was deciding how much of a thing to say rather than whether to say it at all. "Harlan Pike has wanted this land for 8 years, she said. More specifically, he wants the Northeast Creek. The Double P runs about 3,000 head, and in a dry year, their eastern range has inadequate water. Our creek would solve that. John refused to sell it twice, at prices that were not unreasonable. Why? Because John knew that once you sell water rights on the frontier, you've sold the land's future. Whatever you get for it today, you spend 50 years paying for it in ways you didn't anticipate." She picked up her pen again, then set it back down. "Pike made me an offer 4 months after John died. I declined. How did he take that? Politely, she said. Which, with Harlan Pike, means he hadn't decided yet what to do about it. Elias leaned against the door frame. "And now?" "And now," she said. "One of my fence riders reported last week that 3 sections of the northeast line have been cut and respliced. Not broken, cut. Deliberately, and then put back together badly enough that it would hold until the cattle pressure got against it." He straightened. "When were you going to tell me this?" "I'm telling you now." "How many sections?" 3 confirmed. Possibly a 4th, the rider wasn't sure. "Any cattle missing from those sections?" 8 head, we found 6. 2 are still unaccounted for. He exhaled slowly through his nose. "That's not vandalism," he said. "That's a campaign." "I know what it is," she said. "You should have told me sooner." She looked at him steadily. "You're the horseman," she said. "Fence and cattle are Gruber's territory." "Gruber hasn't told you what it means," he said. "He told you what happened. That's different." The silence that followed was not hostile. It was the silence of someone hearing a distinction they hadn't quite articulated to themselves and recognizing it as accurate. "No," she said. "He hasn't. It means someone is running a check on your response time and your vigilance. They're not trying to take cattle yet. 2 ahead is nothing. That could be drift. They're watching whether you notice the fence, how long it takes you to notice, and what you do when you do. They're reading the operation." He paused. "I've seen this before. It's what you do before you move in earnest." Margaret was quiet for a long moment. "What would you do?" she said. It was not rhetorical. She was asking for an actual answer. "First thing tomorrow, I want to ride the entire northeast line myself. Not a rider me. I want to see what's been cut and where, and I want to see the pattern." He paused. "Then I want to move the mares." She frowned. "The mares are in the south pasture, which is the most visible pasture from the road. If someone is reading this operation, they know the horses are there. The mares are the most valuable things on this property after the land itself. I want them somewhere less visible while we figure out what's actually happening." "Where?" Gruber mentioned a box canyon pasture about 4 miles northeast. He said your husband used it for overflow grazing. "Harker's Draw," she said. "It's good grass, reliable water." But it's a long move. I know. But right now your most valuable animals are exactly where anyone looking at this ranch would expect to find them. He met her eyes. If this goes the way I think it might, the horses are going to be leverage. I don't want them where they can be used as leverage. She looked at him for a moment with an expression he'd seen before, the assessing look, the one that was deciding something. Then she nodded once. Ride the line tomorrow. Then we'll talk about the draw. He nodded and started to go. Elias. He turned. She'd picked up her pen again and was looking at the ledger, but she wasn't writing. Thank you for pressing the question. It's the job, he said. It's more than the job, she said simply, and went back to the ledger. He went to find Gruber. The fence line told him everything he needed to know, and several things he'd hoped not to confirm. He rode it the next morning, starting at first light, with Thomas behind him to mark the locations, and what he found was not random. The cuts were spaced at intervals that suggested knowledge, not the random vandalism of someone passing through, but deliberate selection of the sections that would take the longest to spot from the ranch side. Whoever had done it knew the terrain and knew the W's patrol patterns. That meant either someone who'd spent considerable time watching from the pike side of the line, or someone who had information from inside. He didn't say that second part out loud yet, because an accusation without evidence was just damage. He documented everything: location, type of cut, the poor splice work put back after, whether the ground showed cattle pressure. 4 sections confirmed. The fourth one Gruber's rider hadn't been sure about was definite. The wire had been cut and replaced with a slight slack that wouldn't be visible at a casual glance, but would fail under load. 2 things bothered him more than the cuts themselves. First, the northeast sections were the closest to Harker's draw, which meant that if the mares were moved there, whoever was watching the operation would know that too. Second, the cuts were recent, within the past 2 weeks, which meant the timing corresponded almost exactly with the departure of Gerald Whitmore and his family. He turned that over on the ride back and didn't like what it suggested, but he filed it away rather than speaking it, because some thoughts needed more development before they were useful. He reported to Margaret that afternoon and told her what he'd found, minus the second thought, because he needed more before he could do anything with it. She listened with her arms crossed and her jaw set. 4 sections, she said. 4 confirmed. I think we should assume more that haven't been found yet. Gruber. She said it without turning around, and Gruber, who was standing near the barn door, straightened. Why didn't your rider confirm the 4th section? Gruber's jaw worked. He said the wire looked repaired. And he didn't pull it to check the tension. I should have sent him back. He said it with the direct discomfort of a man who knows where he came short and isn't going to waste time defending it. Elias gave him credit for that. Send 2 men tomorrow, Margaret said. Ride the entire perimeter. Not just the northeast, all of it. Yes, ma'am. And I want a rider on the northeast section every day. Alternate them, so it's not the same man at the same time. She turned back to Elias. The mares, she said. I'd like to move them this weekend. Saturday early. Harker's draw. Can we manage that? I can have 4 men and the gates open by 6, Gruber said. He looked at Elias with the straightforward respect of a man who had stopped competing with someone and decided to work alongside them instead. It had been a gradual shift, and it wasn't warm, but it was real. All right, Margaret said. She turned back to the window, looking out toward the northeast pasture. When I was a girl, she said, to neither of them exactly, my father used to say that a man who wants your water wants your life. He just doesn't tell you that's what he wants. She was quiet for a moment. I'm beginning to understand what he meant. Neither Elias nor Gruber answered, because it wasn't the kind of thing that asked for an answer. That evening, Rose found him in the tack room working late, and she came in and sat on an overturned bucket and watched him work for a while, which she did when she had something on her mind but hadn't decided to say it yet. He waited. Thomas says someone is causing trouble for the ranch, she said. Thomas talks too much, he said. He says a man named Pike is trying to take the land. It's a little more complicated than that. Is Mrs. Whitmore scared? He considered the question with the seriousness it deserved, because Rose was not asking casually. I don't think she's scared, he said. I think she's angry. There's a difference. What are you? He looked at her. She was watching him with her gray eyes and her serious expression, and she was 7 years old, and she deserved an honest answer. I'm paying attention, he said. That's what I do when something is wrong. I pay attention until I understand it well enough to do something about it. What if you can't do something about it? Then I pay attention until I find someone who can. She considered this. We're not going to have to sleep under a tree again, are we? The question went into him like a cold finger. He set down the stirrup leather he'd been working and looked at her directly. No, he said. We're not. How do you know? Because he said, that's not going to happen while I can do anything to stop it. She looked at him for a moment with that assessing quality she'd had since she was 4, the quality that saw past what he intended to say to the weight of what he was actually saying. Then she nodded once, satisfied, and climbed off the bucket. Bess says supper was 20 minutes ago. Tell her I'm coming. She went. He sat with the leather in his hands for another minute and let himself feel the full weight of what he'd just said, because he'd meant it not just for Rose, not just for himself, but for this place and the woman who ran it. And that was something he was going to have to reckon with at some point. Not tonight. Tonight there was supper and a fence line to plan and a set of mares to move before the weekend. He moved toward the house. The mares went to Harker's draw on Saturday morning without incident, which satisfied him in principle and worried him in practice. Because the absence of trouble didn't mean the trouble was gone, it meant it was still building. He helped drive them himself, working the edges of the group with Cora, who had turned out to be more useful than her age suggested, once she had a job to do and a direction to move in. 11 mares, 2 nursing foals, the whole group settled into the draw by 9 in the morning with water and good grass and a blind approach from the main road that meant you couldn't see them unless you already knew where to look. Gruber watched him check the draw's entry point and said, "Your husband used this much?" Elias looked up. Gruber caught himself. "Sorry, I meant." "It's all right," Elias said. He went back to checking the gate. "He's not my husband." Right, a pause. Still, it's smart ground. The drawback's against the ridge, so the only access is this end. You'd need to know it was here. Exactly, Elias said. Gruber was quiet. Then you think someone tipped Pike about the fence rotation. It wasn't a question. Elias looked up at him. "I think it's possible," he said. "I'm not saying who or why. Whoever it is has been here long enough to know the schedule," Gruber said. His voice was flat, and his face was careful, which meant he was already running through the same list Elias had been running through for 2 days. "I know," Elias said. "I don't like it. Neither do I." They rode back to the ranch without discussing it further, because there was nothing further to discuss until one of them had something more solid than an uncomfortable pattern. 3 days after the mares moved to the draw, one of Pike's men came to the ranch. Not Pike himself. One of his men, a lean, watchful type named Cord, who came with the easy confidence of a man who knows he's carrying a message someone doesn't want to hear. He asked to speak with Margaret, and she received him in the main room with Elias present, because she had asked Elias to be there, and he'd stood at the back of the room without speaking. Cord delivered his message without preamble, which Elias respected even if he didn't like the message. Pike was prepared to offer $3,000 and for the Northeast water rights, not the land, just the water. A limited use agreement legally documented, with terms favorable to the Double W. It was, Cord said, a generous offer, and Mr. Pike hoped Mrs. Whitmore would consider it seriously. Margaret was quiet for a moment after Cord finished. Then she said, "Tell Mr. Pike I appreciate the offer." "The answer is no." Cord nodded, not surprised. "He thought you might say that. He asked me to mention that the offer has a timeline. 30 days. What happens after 30 days? He didn't say, ma'am. Cord's voice was neutral, but his eyes said something different, not quite an apology, not quite a warning. Somewhere between the two. The expression of a man who is doing a job he's been told to do and has enough decency to be mildly uncomfortable about it. He just said 30 days. After Cord left, Margaret stood in the middle of the main room with her arms at her sides. "He's filing a water claim," Elias said. She turned to look at him. "Explain." "He's going to claim that the creek crosses onto his land long enough to establish shared rights. It may or may not be legally accurate. I don't know the survey well enough, but the threat of a legal challenge costs money and time, and he knows you'd rather settle than litigate. He's wrong about that," she said, with a quietness that had temperature in it. "I know. But he doesn't know he's wrong, which is the problem." He paused. "Do you have the survey documents? The original ones? From when your husband filed the land?" "In the office. I haven't looked at them in years. I'd like to look at them." She looked at him. "Do you know what you'd be looking for?" "I know enough to know whether the creek is entirely on your land from source to stock tank. If it is, his claim has no ground to stand on." He paused. "And I know a man in Hayes who does know the law on this." Worked for a land attorney for 12 years before he moved west. If the documents support you, I'd like to take them to him. She studied him. Who? Man named Odell, the feed merchant. I know him. A pause. He mentioned you to me early on. He said you seemed square. High praise from Odell, Elias said. Highest he gives. She looked at him for another moment. All right, look at the documents. But Elias, she stopped, then said it anyway. Be careful about what you take to town. If Pike has someone feeding him information from inside this ranch, anything you carry out the gate could be reported. He nodded. He'd had the same thought. I'll go on Sunday, he said. My own time. I'll tell anyone who asks it's personal business. She held his gaze for a moment, and he saw in her face the thing she didn't say, not gratitude exactly, but something that was its first cousin, the expression of a person who has been used to carrying everything alone and is still surprised, even now, when someone picks up part of the weight. Sunday, she said, and went to the office to find the survey. He looked at the documents that night by lamplight while Rose slept in the next room. The survey was 40 years old, made when the land was originally filed, and it was precise in the way that old surveys were hand-drawn, carefully notated, the kind of document that took time and cost money and meant every line on it had been walked. The creek ran entirely within the Double W's boundary from its source, a spring on the northeast ridge to where it fed the stock tanks in the lower field. Every foot of it. He traced the line with his finger 3 times to be sure. Whatever Harlan Pike was going to claim, it wasn't going to be the truth. Which meant he wasn't making a legal argument, he was making a pressure argument, counting on the cost and complexity of defending against it, to do the work the argument itself couldn't do. Elias set down the survey and sat back in his chair. There was a sound from outside, not loud, the kind of sound that you process without fully waking up to it, except that something in it was wrong. He sat still and listened, coyote maybe, wind against the barn. Except the wind wasn't up tonight, and what he'd heard had had a regularity to it that animals didn't produce. He was at the door in 4 seconds. The northeast pasture now empty of the mares, just the younger stock was dark and quiet. But at the fence line, where the tree line started, he could see something. Movement, low and deliberate, the kind of movement that was trying not to be movement. He went back inside, put on his boots and coat, took the rifle from behind the door, and went out. He moved along the inside of the fence line, staying in the shadow of the post row, watching the tree line where he'd seen the movement. 40 yards. 30. He stopped and waited, and after 90 seconds he heard it again, a sound that was metal against wood, the sound of a fence tool doing something to wire. He didn't shout, he didn't run. He moved to within 20 yards and stopped and said, in a normal voice, I can see you. There's no good way this ends for you, but there's a way that's better than others. Step away from the fence. Silence. Then the sound of 2 bodies moving fast through brush, back toward the tree line, and the crash of someone pushing through undergrowth at speed. He followed the fence line to where they'd been a section 60 yards north of where he'd been standing. A new cut, just started, the wire snipped and the splice not yet done. They hadn't finished. He stood at the fence in the dark and looked at the tree line and breathed steadily, and what he felt was not fear. It was clarity. The kind of clarity that comes when something you suspected becomes something you know. Pike wasn't waiting for the 30 days to run out. He was moving already, under the cover of the deadline, using the legal threat as a distraction while the real pressure built along the fence lines and in the dark. He repaired the cut himself, right then, with the tools he'd started carrying in his coat pocket 2 days ago, because he'd suspected something like this was coming. And when it was done, he walked back to the house and went to Margaret's door and knocked. A long pause. Then her voice, awake and already braced. What happened? 2 men at the northeast fence. I ran them off. They didn't finish the cut. He paused. I need to ride to Hayes first thing tomorrow. Not Sunday. Tomorrow. Another pause. The survey? And something else, he said. I think we need the sheriff involved before this goes any further. Because the next thing Pike does isn't going to be fence lines. He heard her move inside. Then the door opened. She was in her robe, her hair loose, a lamp in her hand, and she looked at him with an expression that was completely awake and completely focused, and had nothing soft in it. What's the next thing? She said. I don't know exactly, he said. But I know it's coming faster than he let on, and I know that whatever it is, he's going to want it to look like it was your fault. Your loss, your mistake, your failure, he met her eyes. He's not just trying to buy the water. He's trying to break the ranch. The lamp flame moved in a draft from somewhere. Her face in that light was tired and certain, not frightened, and she looked at him for a long moment before she said quietly, "Then we won't let him." "No," he said. "We won't." He went back to his quarters and sat on the edge of his bed and looked at the wall for a long time before he lay down, and he didn't sleep for another hour, and when he did, his sleep was the shallow and watchful kind that was almost worse than no sleep at all, because you got none of the rest and all of the dreaming. But in the morning he was up before light. There was work to do, and Elias Mercer had never in his life found any comfort in waiting for it to come to him. He rode to Hayes before sunrise, with the survey documents folded inside his coat and the conversation with Margaret still sitting in his chest like something that hadn't finished landing. The town was barely awake when he tied Cora to the rail outside Odell's feed store. The merchant was already in Elias, could see lamplight through the front window, because Odell was the kind of man who opened his own store before anyone else needed it open, which was a quality Elias had always respected without entirely understanding. He knocked twice and waited. Odell answered the door in his apron, took one look at Elias's face, and stepped aside without asking questions. That was another quality Elias respected. "Coffee's on," Odell said. They sat at the small table in the back, where Odell did his accounts, and Elias laid out the survey documents and explained what he'd found and what had happened at the fence line the night before. Odell listened without interrupting, which by this point Elias had come to understand was not common courtesy, but genuine intelligence the man was processing, not just waiting for his turn to speak. When Elias finished, Odell looked at the survey for a long moment. He traced the creek line with one finger, the same way Elias had done the night before. "Source to tank," he said. "All of it," Elias said. Pike's got no legal ground then. A claim would require the water to cross his boundary at some point, even briefly. Odell tapped the map. "This doesn't." "I know. But Margaret would still have to defend against the claim. Attorney fees, court time, and meanwhile Pike keeps pressure on the fence lines, and she's managing two fights at once." Odell leaned back and looked at him with the measuring expression that was apparently his version of deep thought. "What do you want from me? You worked for a land attorney. 12 years in Missouri. That was a while ago. Long enough to know how a water rights challenge gets filed and how it gets beaten." "In Missouri," Odell said, "Kansas law isn't identical, but you know the shape of it." Odell was quiet for a moment. "There's a man in Salina who handles land disputes. Name of Carew. He's good and he's not cheap, but he knows Kansas water law better than most judges do." He paused. "The survey alone is your strongest argument. If Carew files a preemptive declaration of ownership before Pike files anything, you change the whole shape of the fight. Pike would be challenging an established legal record instead of contesting an open question. How long does that take? Done right? 3 weeks, maybe 4. Pike gave 30 days. Then you'd better move fast." Odell stood up and went to the shelf where he kept a small wooden box of business cards and correspondence, sorted through it, and came back with a card. "Carew, tell him I sent you. We'll see you without an appointment." Elias took the card. "One more thing." Odell sat back down. "The fence cuts were deliberate and they're recent, and they're coming from the Pike side of the line. 2 men at the wire last night. I ran them off, but I couldn't identify them. I need the sheriff to know what's happening before this is further." He paused. "What do you know about the sheriff?" Odell tilted his head slightly. "Younger than he should be for the job. Not corrupt, which is more than you could say for the last one. He's cautious, though he won't move without something solid. The unfinished cut is still there. Fresh wire damage, tool marks. That's something solid." "It is," Odell said. "Take him out to see it yourself. Don't just report it, take him out. Men like Dowd need to see things with their own eyes before they'll commit to a position." Elias nodded, folded the survey carefully back inside his coat, and stood up. "Thank you." "Don't thank me. Go see Carew and go see Dowd, and don't wait until tomorrow to do either." He went to the sheriff's office next. Dowd was younger than Elias expected, maybe 30, with an earnest face and a careful manner that confirmed Odell's assessment. He listened to Elias's account with a notepad open and his pen moving steadily, which was either diligence or the appearance of it. When Elias finished, Dowd asked 3 questions. When had the first fence damage been reported? Had any of the cutting tools been recovered? And had anyone on the Double W seen Pike's men directly? "Not directly," Elias said. "But the pattern of the cuts is too deliberate to be coincidence, and the 2 men last night were on the Double W side of the fence line, which is trespass regardless of what they were doing." Dowd tapped his pen on the notepad. I can ride out and look at the site, he said. If the physical evidence supports trespass, I can open an inquiry. That's different from accusing Pike directly. I understand, Elias said. When can you ride out? Dowd looked at his wall like there might be a schedule there. Day after tomorrow. Tomorrow would be better, Elias said. Not aggressively, just directly. Dowd looked at him. Why the urgency? Because Pike's deadline is 30 days, and he's already moving before the deadline. That tells me he's not actually waiting for the deadline. He kept his eyes on Dowd's. A man who tells you you've got 30 days and then sends men to your fence that same week isn't negotiating. He's managing the story he's going to tell afterward. Dowd was quiet. His pen stopped moving. Tomorrow afternoon, he said. 2 o'clock. I'll be at the ranch. He rode back to the Double W with Odell's card in his pocket and the sheriff's commitment in his head, and he spent the ride trying to account for everything he knew and everything he didn't, which was a habit he'd developed not from training, but from years of situations, where the thing he hadn't accounted for was the thing that mattered most. What he didn't know was whether Pike had a man inside the Double W. The timing of the fence cuts beginning almost exactly when Gerald Whitmore and his family left could have been coincidence. The knowledge of the patrol schedule that the cuts implied could have come from long observation of the fence line from the Pisk side. It didn't have to mean an informant, but the precision of it bothered him. The cuts had been in the sections that would take longest to spot. That was specific knowledge. He didn't say this to Margaret when he got back. He told her about Odell, about the attorney and Selena, about Dowd and the appointment for the next afternoon. She listened with her arms crossed and her expression contained in the way it got when she was holding several things at once and sorting them by priority. Selena, she said, that's a 2-day ride. I can go this week. Take the survey documents. You'll be away from the ranch. He looked at her. Gruber can manage the operation for 2 days. The mares are in the draw. The Northeast line has 2 riders on rotation now. He paused. The legal piece is the most important thing right now. If Carew files the preemptive declaration, Pike loses his best move. She was quiet for a moment. Go Thursday, she said, after Dowd's visit. I want you here for that, all right. Dowd came at 2 o'clock the next afternoon as agreed, with a deputy whose name Elias didn't catch, a quiet young man who took notes in a small book. Elias walked them to the fence site himself, the unfinished cut from 2 nights before, and stood back while Dowd crouched over the wire and looked at it with the focused attention of someone who'd decided to take this seriously. Fresh, the deputy said. The snip marks are clean. Rain would have started to rust these edges within a few days. Dowd looked at the ground around the post. The soil was soft enough to hold impressions, and the impressions were there 2 sets of boot prints, one heavier than the other, both approaching from the east, from the Pike side of the fence line. The trespass is clear, Dowd said. He straightened up. The question is whether I can connect it to Pike specifically. Can you ask him? Elias said. Dowd looked at him with the expression of a man who found this question slightly naive. I can ask him, he said. He'll deny it. His men will say they were elsewhere, without someone who saw them cross from the double P-. I saw them, Elias said, not clearly enough to identify them. But I can put 2 men at this fence line at this hour. That establishes trespass, Dowd said. It doesn't establish Pike ordered it. Then let me ask you something, Elias said. He kept his voice level. If a man offers to buy something, is refused, gives a 30-day deadline, and then has someone tampering with the refused party's fence lines inside that same 30 days, what does that suggest to you? Dowd was quiet. He was looking at the fence rather than at Elias, which meant he was thinking rather than managing his expression. It suggests a pattern, he said. A pattern isn't proof. No, Elias said, but it's a start, and if I come back to you with more of the pattern, I need to know you're in a position to act on it. Dowd looked at him then. Bring me something I can take to a judge, he said. I'll act on it. It was not a promise of enthusiasm, but it was a commitment, and Elias understood the difference. He rode to Selena on Thursday morning with the survey documents and Odell's card, and arrived at Carew's office by mid-afternoon of the following day. The attorney was a compact, precise man of about 50, who read the survey in 4 minutes, asked 6 questions, and then said, I can file the declaration within 2 weeks. It costs $40, and it puts Pike in the position of challenging a legal record rather than establishing one. That's a significantly worse position for him. Do it, Elias said. You have authority from Mrs. Whitmore? He produced the letter Margaret had written before he left, in her precise hand, authorizing him to retain legal counsel on the ranch's behalf in the matter of the Northeast water rights. Carew read it, nodded, and held out his hand. "I'll send confirmation to the ranch when it's filed." Elias shook it, paid the retainer from the money Margaret had given him, and rode back. He was home. He'd started thinking of it that way without making a decision to, by Saturday evening. Reported to Margaret in the office, and she listened, and when he was done, she said, $40. $40, he said. John would say that's cheap for what it buys. Your husband sounds like he knew the value of things. She looked at him with a complicated expression that was there and then gone. He did, she said, most of the time. She closed the account book she'd had open. Thank you for going. I know it wasn't easy to be away. Rose was fine, he said. Bess had her making bread. The corner of Margaret's mouth moved. How did that go? Bess said it was edible. Rose was very proud of that. Edible is high praise from Bess, she said. That's what I told her. They sat for a moment in a silence that was not uncomfortable, which was its own kind of thing, a silence that two people have earned together by working through enough noise. Then Margaret said, Gerald wrote. He waited. He wants to know how things are progressing. She said it with a flatness that held opinion inside it. He heard about the fence trouble. He wants to know if I'm managing the situation adequately. What did you tell him? I haven't answered yet. She looked at him. He also asked, with what he clearly considered tact, whether my confidence in your judgment was fully warranted, given that you had only been here a short time. Elias looked at his hands. What's your answer to that? She considered it for a moment, not as a formality, but as if she were actually reviewing the evidence. Yes, she said, fully warranted. A pause. I'll tell him that. He nodded and left before he said something that would complicate the careful distance he'd been maintaining with some effort for the past 2 months. 10 days after he got back from Salina, Carew's confirmation arrived, a brief letter stating that the declaration of water rights ownership had been filed with the county court and was now part of the official land record of Ellis County, Kansas. He took the letter to Margaret and watched her read it. When she finished, she set it on the desk and put both hands flat on it, the way a person steadies themselves on something solid. Now he'd have to challenge the record, she said. Which costs him money and puts him on the wrong side of the argument, Elias said. He's been counting on you being too tired or too intimidated to fight it properly. This changes the math. Will it stop him? He thought about being careful with his answer, and then decided that careful was the wrong choice. It'll hurt his best move, he said. I don't know if it stops him. A man like Pike, who's been after this land for 8 years, he doesn't just have one move. She looked at him steadily. Then we watch for the next one. Yes, he said. The next one came 11 days later, at 2 a.m, and it came with fire. Elias woke to the smell first, the unmistakable sharp smell of smoke that's moving on air, not the comfortable smell of a wood stove or a cook fire, but the urgent, spreading smell of something structural burning. He was at the window in 3 seconds, and he saw it before he was fully registered as awake. The hay barn, the eastern one, the one closest to the fence line, was lit at the northeast corner, and the fire was not new. It had been going long enough that the corner boards were fully involved, and the flames were moving upward along the wall toward the loft. He pulled on his boots and was out the door before he'd finished the thought. Fire! He didn't shout it once he kept shouting it as he ran, because that was the only job right now. Getting people up, getting bodies moving, and the ranch woke around him the way ranches wake, which was not gracefully but effectively. Lights appearing in windows and doors coming open and voices calling back and forth. Gruber was out of the bunkhouse before Elias reached the barn. Thomas was behind him. 2 more hands coming from the far end. Waterline from the south tank, Elias said to Gruber. Get it to the east wall. We can't save the corner, but we can cut it off. Gruber was already moving. Thomas, the horses in the main barn. Get them out. All of them. Move them to the south corral and close the gate. Yes, sir, and Thomas, the boy, turned. Cutter first. He'll panic if the smoke reaches him. Get him out before the others. The boy ran. Elias turned to the burning barn. The hay stored in the loft was this season's supply 12 tons, enough to run the ranch through winter. If the fire reached the loft, there was nothing to do but contain it and watch it go. The structure might be savable if they could cut the fire off at the top of the east wall before it reached the roof beam. He grabbed a bucket and ran. The next 20 minutes were smoke and heat, and the physical work of water, of bodies moving fast in an organized way, of Gruber's voice coordinating the bucket line with the flat authority of a man who'd been in this situation before. The east wall burned, but the bucket line held the advance, and when Elias looked up through the smoke, he could see barely, but he could see that the fire wasn't moving as fast toward the roof as it had been. And then he heard Margaret's voice behind him, not panicked, fully alert. "Rose is not in the quarters." He turned. Margaret was 10 feet behind him, already looking toward the barn, with an expression that was controlled on the surface, and something else entirely underneath it. She wasn't in her bed. "I went to check. Bess has her." "Where?" Bess took her to the south porch. "She's safe." She said it fast, because she'd seen his face. "She's safe. I wanted you to know." He exhaled, one hard breath. "The barn, I know. What do you need?" "A rope. Heavy rope. There's one on the west wall, inside the main barn left of the door. The thick coil." She was gone before he finished saying it. He turned back to the fire. The east wall was still going, but the bucket line had held the spread, and Gruber's men were making ground. There was a real chance, not a certain chance, but a real one that they could save the structure. Then he heard Cutter. The sound was unmistakable, a high, crashing sound from inside the hay barn, not the main barn, which meant the stallion was in the wrong barn. He spun and looked for Thomas, and Thomas was at the south corral gate, horses milling around him, his face white. "He was in the hay barn," Thomas said, his voice high and thin. "I checked the main barn first, and he wasn't. Someone must have moved him." "When?" I don't know. Elias was already moving toward the hay barn's main door. The fire was in the northeast corner, the door was southwest, which meant he had a path, but the smoke in the barn was thick and moving. He pulled his shirt up over his nose and went in. The interior was orange-lit and churning, smoke dropping from the ceiling in the way smoke does when it's being heated from above. He could hear Cutter before he could see him, the crashing of hooves against stall boards, the sound of a horse in total panic, which was a sound that operated on something below rational thought. He found the stall by sound, not sight. Cutter was in the third stall from the south wall. Someone had moved him, and moved him recently, because the horse hadn't been here this morning. That thought registered, and then he let it go, because right now there was only the horse and the smoke and the fire eating the northwest corner 20 feet away. He opened the stall door. Cutter came out hard, not at him, just out, looking for space, his eyes white and rolling. Elias stepped into his path, not to stop him, but to redirect him, the way you redirect a panicked horse, using his body as a guide rather than a barrier. The horse hit his shoulder going past, and it was enough impact to stagger him, but he got a hand on the lead rope that was still, by some luck, clipped to the stallion's halter. He didn't try to hold him. He ran with him toward the door, keeping the pressure on the rope just enough to keep the horse turning south rather than north, toward the fire. They came out the door in a rush of smoke, into the cold night air, and Elias went down on one knee in the dirt, and the horse pulled the rope through his hand until he caught the end of it. And for a moment it was just the two of them. Cutter standing with his legs splayed and his sides heaving, and Elias on his knee in the dirt holding the end of a lead rope with both hands. Then the east side of the barn's roof caught. The sound was immediate, and total, a hump of ignition, and then the fire was up through the roof beam and the loft was going, and Elias was up and moving, pulling the horse away from the structure, because a burning roof meant falling debris, and neither of them could afford that. He had Cutter 20 yards clear when the section of the east wall gave way. The sound it made was the sound of something large failing all at once, and the crash of it hit the ground and sent sparks up into the dark air, and Cutter surged against the rope, and Elias planted his feet in the dirt and held. He was still holding on when he heard Margaret behind him. "Elias." Her voice was taut, controlled, the rope. He looked up. She was standing 5 yards away with the heavy coil he'd sent her for, and her face in the firelight was reading him, not the horse. "I can take him," she said. "He's not calm. I've handled horses my whole life." She came forward and took the lead rope from his hands, and their hands were briefly both on it, and she didn't flinch at the tension of the horse trying to pull. She absorbed it with both arms and shifted her weight the way someone does, who has been doing this since childhood. "Go," she said. "Gruber needs you," he went. The fire burned for another hour. They saved the structure barely, but the east wall was gone, and the loft was a total loss. 12 tons of winter hay, and the smell of smoke was in everything for days afterward. No horses were lost, no people were hurt, and that was the accounting that mattered at the end of it. When it was over, when the last of the bucket line had finished, and the wall was down to embers, and Gruber's men were leaning on things with the exhausted, flat expressions of people who'd given everything they had. Elias walked back to where Margaret was standing with Cutter at the far end of the south corral. The horse was calmer now. Not calm, he might not be calm for days, but the immediate terror had settled into the post-panic stillness that Elias recognized. His head was down, his breathing was slower. "How's your shoulder?" Margaret said. He'd forgotten about the shoulder. Cutter had hit it hard coming out of the stall. He rolled it experimentally and regretted it. "Fine," he said. She looked at him. In the firelight, with the smoke still in the air, and both of them covered in it, she looked like someone who had just fought something and won, and not completely. "You went in there alone," she said. "There wasn't time for. I know why you did it." She wasn't accusing him. Her voice had something different in it. "I know exactly why." She paused. "I went in after you." He looked at her. "You weren't behind me. I came around the north side. I was going for the door when you came out with him." She held the lead rope loosely now. The horse had dropped his head, almost to the ground. "I had the rope." He stood there and absorbed the image of her going around to the north side, toward the fire, because she thought he was still in there. He didn't know what to do with that image, so he just held it. "That was a bad decision," he said. "Yes," she said. "Probably." They stood in the smoke-smelling dark for a moment. Cutter was moved, he said. He said it quietly, because this was not a thing to say loudly in a yard full of exhausted men. He was in the main barn this morning. Someone moved him to the hay barn before the fire started. Margaret was still. "You're certain? I checked every stall on my last round tonight." He was in his place. That was at 10. He paused. Fire started at 2. The silence between them had a weight to it now. It wasn't just the night or the smoke. "That means someone on this ranch," she started. "Maybe," he said. "Or someone from outside who knew the layout well enough." He paused. Either way, the fire wasn't random. Moving Cutter into the burning barn that was intentional. They wanted to lose the stallion. She took a breath, slow and careful. "They wanted me to lose the most valuable thing on the property. And they wanted me occupied with the horse while the barn finished burning." He looked at the ruined east wall. This was planned. All of it. The fire wasn't an accident, and it wasn't just about hay. Margaret was quiet for a long time. The horse breathed. The embers ticked. "The documents from the barn office," she said suddenly, and her voice had changed. "The secondary set of the survey. John kept a copy in the hay barn office in case of—" She stopped. Elias turned and looked at the ruined structure. "Is it gone?" he said. "I don't know," she said. The office was in the northeast corner. The northeast corner was where the fire had started. They looked at each other in the dark, and Elias saw in her face the full shape of what had happened tonight, not just a fire, not just a horse moved to die, but a systematic attempt to destroy the evidence that protected the water rights, to take the stallion, and to leave her standing in the ash, wondering how much she had left. "The original survey is in the county court record now," he said. Carew filed it. "They can't touch that." She closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them, they were steady. "Yes," she said. "You made sure of that." "You can rebuild the barn," he said. "The hay can be replaced. The water record is safe. The mares are in the draw, and Cutter is standing right there." He paused. "Pike burned down an empty barn and got nothing he came for." She looked at him with something that was more than relief. It was the look of a person who has been carrying weight alone for a long time, and has only recently started to believe that someone else is actually holding part of it, not pretending to, not offering to, but actually holding it. "Come inside," she said. "Bess will have coffee on. You're bleeding." He looked at his hand, the rope burn from catching Cutter's lead, a raw stripe across the palm he hadn't registered until now. "It's not bad, I know," she said. "Come in anyway." He walked beside her back toward the house, and Cutter followed on the rope behind them like a horse that had decided, tentatively and without committing fully, that this man was worth following. Which was, when Elias thought about it later, about the same place he'd arrived at with the ranch, and with the woman who owned it. Not committed fully. Not yet. But following. In the morning, Sheriff Dowd came without being called, because someone in town had seen the smoke, and he came with his deputy and a harder expression than he'd had on his previous visit. He walked the burn site, and he walked the stall where Cutter had been moved, and he looked at the lead rope coiled on the hook in the hay barn's surviving office. The southwest corner had held. The northeast was gone, and he asked Elias 3 questions. All of them pointed. Then he rode to the double P. He came back 2 hours later with a different expression, and he asked to speak with Margaret privately. And when she came out of that conversation, she came to find Elias in the south corral, where he was checking the horses. Dowd found 2 of Pike's men with burns on their hands, she said. Fresh ones. One of them had hay ash in the cuff of his boot. Elias looked at her. What did Pike say? That his men had been fighting a grass fire on the Double P's South Range last night. She paused. Dowd says there's no evidence of any grass fire on the Double P. He's filing charges. Arson and trespass. She stopped. And there was something else. She looked at him directly. One of the hands Pike employs, he came to work for the Double P 3 months ago. Before that, he was with the Double W. Elias was quiet. A young man named Devlin, she said. He left the month before you arrived. Gruber said he was let go for reliability problems. And he took the layout of the ranch with him, Elias said. The patrol schedule. The stall assignments. Yes, her voice was even, but her jaw was set in the way that meant she was managing something she didn't want to show. Dowd is including that in the filing. Using inside knowledge of a property to facilitate criminal trespass. It changes the charge, Elias said. It does. She looked at the horses for a moment. I owe you something, she said. No. You moved the mares before any of this started. You got Carew to file the declaration. You rode to Hayes in the dark after the fence cuts, and you went into a burning barn for a horse that nearly killed you when you first got here. She turned to look at him, and she was not a woman who said things she didn't mean, and she held his gaze with both of hers. You did all of that for this ranch. I want you to know that I understand what that cost. It's the job, he said. Stop saying that, she said. He looked at her. It hasn't been just the job for some time, she said, and we both know it. I'm not asking you to say anything about it. I'm just saying that I know it, and I'm not afraid of knowing it. The south corral was quiet. A horse moved somewhere behind him. The smoke smell was still in the air, would be for days, the smell of something that had been attacked and had held. All right, he said. She nodded once and went back to the house. He stood in the corral and looked at the ruined east wall of the hay barn against the morning sky. And somewhere behind him, in the south pasture, Cutter was moving through the grass with his head up and his ears forward, which was different from 3 months ago in every way that mattered. The charges Dowd filed did not move fast, because nothing in the Kansas legal system of 1,885 moved fast, and anyone who expected otherwise had not spent enough time in Kansas. What they did was change the air. That was the only way Elias could describe it. The quality of things shifted in the days after the sheriff rode to the Double P and came back with burns on 2 men's hands and ash in a boot cuff, and the beginning of a case that Harland. Pike had apparently not anticipated anyone building. The fence tampering stopped overnight. The nightly walks Elias had been doing along the northeast line, which had produced 3 separate incidents over 6 weeks, produced nothing. The line held. The wire stayed whole. Pike's silence was louder than his pressure had been, and Elias distrusted it accordingly. He said as much to Gruber one morning while they were replacing the burned east wall's foundation posts, which was the first phase of rebuilding the hay barn, a project that would take the better part of 2 months and cost more than Margaret had budgeted for the season. A man like that doesn't go quiet because he's finished, Elias said. He was tamping the base of a post while Gruber held it plumb, and the physical work helped him think, which had always been true of him. He goes quiet because he's figuring out the next move. Maybe he figures the next move is the courtroom, Gruber said. Maybe. Carew says the water declaration is solid and Dowd's arson case is building. If Pike has a decent attorney, that attorney is telling him right now that the legal route is closed and the criminal exposure is real. He paused, which leaves him with losing quietly or making noise on his way out. Gruber grunted. What kind of noise? I don't know yet. That's the part I'm watching for. The noise came, but not in any form Elias had anticipated, which was, he reflected, how it usually went with the things that actually mattered. It came from Gerald Whitmore. A letter arrived at the ranch on a Wednesday, addressed to Margaret, and she read it at the breakfast table with the expression she got when something was confirming what she'd already suspected rather than surprising her. She folded it when she was done and set it beside her coffee cup. Gerald has retained an attorney, she said. Elias looked up. He's not, it isn't legal action, she said. She caught his expression. He says he's retained an attorney to help him understand his options regarding the ranch's management. She paused. He's been in contact with Pike. The table was quiet. Bess had gone to the kitchen. Rose was at school. She'd started attending the town school 3 weeks ago, which had been Margaret's suggestion and Rose's immediate and wholehearted adoption. The quiet was just the two of them. How long? Elias said. He doesn't say, but reading between the lines, she smoothed the letter against the table without looking at it. Longer than I'd like. What does he want? A seat at the decision table, he calls it. He believes that as John's closest living male relative, he is standing to question the management of the estate. She looked at Elias directly. He also says, and this is the part that I imagine took him some effort to write, that he believes my judgment has been compromised by personal attachment to an employee. Elias set down his coffee cup. Is he wrong? She looked at him steadily. About the attachment? No. She held his gaze without apology. About the judgment? Yes. Entirely. He nodded. He felt something settle in his chest, not the anxious way things had been settling lately, but with a kind of finality, like a gate latch dropping into place. What's the legal reality? Does he have standing? I spoke to Carew about this when I was in Salina last month. She said it without preface, which meant she'd anticipated this possibility and had been managing it quietly, which was so characteristic of her that it almost made him smile. He doesn't. John left the ranch entirely to me, with no provision for family consultation. Gerald has no legal authority over management decisions. He knows that? His attorney will have told him by now, if he didn't already know. The letter isn't a legal threat. She paused, choosing words carefully. It's an attempt to make me doubt myself enough to act differently. Is it working? She looked at him with the dry expression that surfaced when she found a question somewhat beneath the conversation. No, she said. Then we write back. We acknowledge the letter. We state clearly that the ranch's legal situation is being handled by retained counsel, and we invite him to direct any further questions to Carew. He paused. And we don't write it angrily, because an angry letter from you gives him something to show people. She considered this. You've done this before. I've been in situations where someone was trying to use a letter to provoke a reaction, he said. Ranch disputes, employment disagreements. The reaction is usually worth more to them than whatever they asked for. She nodded slowly. I'll write it today. She folded Gerald's letter and put it in her pocket. And then I'd like to talk about something else. Something that isn't Pike or Gerald or attorneys. He waited. The foreman position, she said. I've been calling you the horseman since the day you arrived, which was accurate when you got here and has been increasingly inaccurate for the past 2 months. You're running this operation, Elias. The fence riders, the patrol rotation, the legal strategy, the move to Harker's Draw, that's foreman work. Gruber knows it. The hands know it, and I've known it for some time. She met his eyes. I want to make it official. $40 a month. The title, the authority, and the responsibility. He was quiet for a moment. Not because he was uncertain, he'd been doing the work, long enough that the title felt like a formality, but because there was something in being offered it that required a moment of honest acknowledgement. Gruber, he said. Gruber and I spoke about it last, she said. He said, and I'm quoting him because I want you to hear it. Exactly. He said you'd earned it the morning you walked into the corridor with Cutter, and everything since had been confirmation. He thought about Gruber saying that, and what it cost a proud man to say it, and what it said about the kind of man Gruber was. All right, he said. All right, she said. And that was that. The arson case moved through the county court over the following 6 weeks, with the grinding, unhurried pace of legal proceedings in small jurisdictions, where the judge held court twice a month, and everyone involved had other things to do the rest of the time. Pike's attorney, a man from Wichita who arrived in Hays with the practiced confidence of someone who handled rural disputes as a minor inconvenience, attempted 3 separate arguments, each of which Dowd and the county prosecutor dismantled with the physical evidence that had been carefully preserved: the boot ash, the burn injuries on the 2 men, the lead rope in the wrong place, the fence tools found abandoned near the cut wire. The 2 men Pike's hands, one named Crane, and one whose name appeared in the record as M. Satterley pleaded their cases separately, and Crane, apparently deciding that loyalty to an employer who was facing his own legal exposure was a poor investment, provided a statement to the prosecutor that described, in sufficient detail, the instruction he'd received and from whom he'd received it. It had not come directly from Pike. It had come from Pike's ranch manager, a man named Obert, who was apparently the instrument through which most of the Double P's less official business was conducted. Obert claimed no knowledge of the arson specifically, which was the kind of claim that everyone in the courtroom understood, and no one could entirely disprove. What could be proven was the trespass, the fence tampering, and the fire. Crane and Satterley were convicted and sentenced. Obert was fined and given a suspended term that the judge made clear would become a real term at the first subsequent infraction. Pike himself sat through 3 days of proceedings with the controlled expression of a man who had decided that appearing unconcerned was his best available posture, and he left the courthouse without charges filed against him personally, which was the outcome his Wichita attorney had worked toward and achieved. Elias watched this from the gallery on the final day, sitting beside Margaret, with Gruber on her other side. When it was done and the courtroom was emptying, Margaret sat for a moment without moving. "He walks out," she said. It wasn't quite a question. "His men take the conviction," Elias said. "He takes the lesson." What lesson? That the Double W isn't what he thought it was. The woman running it has a water declaration on record, legal counsel she can reach, a sheriff who takes her calls seriously, and enough documentation of every incident to make the next campaign more expensive than this one was. He paused. A man like Pike does arithmetic. He's doing it right now. She looked at him. "You think he's done?" "I think the Double W stopped looking like opportunity and started looking like work," he said. "Most men who go after the easy target stop when the target stops being easy." She was quiet for a moment. Then, very quietly, "John would have liked you." He didn't know what to say to that. He looked at the front of the empty courtroom instead and let the statement exist without covering it. "Come on," she said. "Rose is at Bess's sister's house, and we need to get her before dark." They rode back to the ranch in the late afternoon light, the three of them, Elias, Margaret, Gruber, mostly quiet, the comfortable quiet of people who've been through something together and don't need to narrate it. Gruber peeled off at the barn without fanfare. Elias and Margaret continued to the house. Rose was on the porch when they arrived, sitting on the step with Needle the cat on her lap, doing the arithmetic Bess had set for her with the focused expression she brought to all official tasks. She looked up when they came in. "Did they win?" she said. "Close enough," Elias said. She considered this. "What does that mean?" "It means the bad men got in trouble and the ranch is safe." "Oh," she looked at Margaret. "Are you happy?" Margaret looked at the girl on the porch steps, with the cat and the arithmetic and the matter-of-fact question, and something in her face moved in a way that didn't quite compose itself back into the expression she normally wore. "Yes," she said. "I am good," Rose said, and went back to her arithmetic. Elias tied the horses and unsaddled and did the last check of the day, which he would do every day for the rest of his life at this ranch, because it was simply part of the shape of things now. He walked the near pasture in the October dark, which was colder than it had been, but not yet the hard cold that was coming. The horses were where they should be. The fence was whole. The hay barn's rebuilt east wall was raw new lumber against the older weathered boards, and it would look strange until it didn't, until the season got into it and the color evened out. He stood at the pasture fence for a while, not doing anything in particular, just standing. He thought about the cottonwood tree. It was maybe 4 miles west on the Saline Road, and it was still there. He'd passed it twice since he'd been at the Double W, once on his way to town and once coming back, and both times he'd looked at the base of it where he'd sat, with Rose against his chest in the October dark, his coat over her, nothing in his saddlebag, and nowhere particular to go. He thought about the kind of pride that nearly kept him from accepting the ride Margaret offered. Not the good kind of pride, the other kind. The kind that is actually fear in better clothing, fear of being seen to need something, fear of what it means when you can't manage on your own. He'd been carrying that kind for a long time, and he'd gotten so used to the weight that he'd started thinking the weight was him. It wasn't him. He understood that more clearly now than he had any point in his life, because what he'd found here, not just the roof and the wages, but the work that was real, and the woman who treated him like a man capable of thinking rather than just executing, and the place where Rose slept in a real bed and learned arithmetic from Bess, and named a cat, none of that had required him to be without need. It had required him to be without pretense. Those were different things. He'd confused them for years. He heard the door of the house and then footsteps on the dry ground, and he knew who it was before he turned around. Margaret came to the fence and stood beside him, close enough that he could feel the warmth of her even in the cold. She wasn't wearing a coat, which meant she'd come out on an impulse rather than a plan, which was unusual enough for her that he noticed it. They looked at the pasture for a moment. Gerald wrote again, she said. Already. I think he'd written it before he got my reply to the first one. It arrived today. She paused. He's withdrawing his concern. His attorney told him he had no ground, Elias said. Almost certainly. But he also said. She stopped, and in the pause he could feel her deciding something. He said he'd watched the news of the trial from Lawrence, and that the ranch appeared to be in capable hands. He said he hoped I was well. A beat. He didn't mention you specifically. That's probably as close to a concession as he gets, Elias said. It is, she said. Exactly. Another pause. The horses moved in the dark. Somewhere in the far pasture, Cutter made a sound, not distress, just presence, the way horses announce themselves to the dark when they feel like it. I want to ask you something, Margaret said, and I want you to answer me honestly, not carefully. He turned to look at her. When the fire was over and you found out Cutter had been moved deliberately, you came to my door at 2 a.m, and you told me what you'd figured out, and you said we wouldn't let Pike break the ranch. She met his eyes directly. Did you mean we, or were you being polite? He thought about being careful, and then he thought about what she'd said, about careful being insufficient, and he told her the truth. I meant we, he said. She held his gaze. And the other morning, when you told Rose we weren't going to sleep under a tree again, you said it like you were making a promise to more than just her. He was quiet for a moment. I noticed you heard that. I was behind you in the hallway, she said. I wasn't eavesdropping. I was coming to ask about breakfast, a pause. But I heard it. Then you know what I meant, he said. She looked at him for a long moment. The wind moved through the grass. The night was cold and clear, and the stars were the particular abundance that you only got in flat country, where nothing interrupted the sky from horizon to horizon. I'm not a simple situation, she said. This ranch is complicated, and the history of it is complicated, and I am 44 years old, and I have been running this place alone for over a year, and I have gotten used to my own counsel. She said it the way she said everything directly, without softening it, because that was who she was. I'm telling you that so you understand what you'd be. She stopped. What you'd be choosing if you were choosing. I've been on this ranch for 5 months, he said. Nothing about you has surprised me in a way that made me want to leave, including the complicated parts. She was quiet. You should also know, he said, that I am a man who came here with a horse that's too old, a child who asks too many questions, and a record of employment that was, at that particular moment, entirely theoretical. He paused. I'm not a simple situation either. Something crossed her face, not a smile. Exactly. But the precondition of one. I know what you are, she said. I've had 5 months to watch. He nodded. Then we both know what we're choosing. She looked at him for another moment, and then she turned back to the pasture, and they stood side by side at the fence in the dark. And that was how it started, not dramatically. Not with the kind of declaration that announces itself. Just two people standing next to each other in the cold, having told the truth and decided to stay. That was enough for one night. Maybe more than enough. Winter came in hard that year, the way Kansas winters arrived without negotiation, and the new east wall of the hay barn held against the first heavy snow of December, which was the test Elias had been waiting for, without saying he was waiting for it. He walked the structure after the storm and found one section of new flashing that had lifted slightly at the corner. He fixed it in 20 minutes, and the rest was solid. The mares came back from Harker's draw in November, all 11 of them, and both foals, which had grown into themselves over the summer and fall, and moved now with the beginning of their adult shape. Cutter went to the south pasture and stood at the fence line watching them arrive, and something in his manner had the quality of a horse who remembers what it is to be a breeding stallion, rather than a fearful animal in a stall. They turned him out with the mares in the first week of December, and he moved among them, like he was relearning a language he'd spoken his whole life and then been forced to forget. Elias watched from the fence rail. Thomas was beside him, because Thomas was almost always beside someone watching something, which was a quality that would serve him very well if he ever learned to pair it with the patience, to wait for what he was watching. So that's it? Thomas said. Just turn them together? Just turn them together, Elias said. And in the spring. Foals, Elias said. With any luck, foals that carry Cutter's lines, which is what this whole operation is built for. Thomas looked at the pasture. Cutter was moving at an easy trot now, head high, doing what horses do when they are in the right place for the first time in a long time. He's different than he was, Thomas said. Yes, Elias said. Because of you. Because he was given time and reason, Elias said. The time was mine. The reason was his. He did the hard part. Thomas looked sideways at him with the expression of someone testing whether this is wisdom or deflection and not being entirely sure. Elias thought it was probably both, which was true of most things worth saying. Rose's first school term ended in December, and her teacher, a woman named Mrs. Aldrich, sent home a brief note with her that said Rose had a fine mathematical mind and strong opinions about literature, the latter of which she was learning to express with appropriate restraint. Elias read this note twice and showed it to Margaret, who read it and pressed her mouth together in a line that was absolutely a suppressed laugh. Appropriate restraint, Margaret said. She's working on it, Elias said. She gets the strong opinions from somewhere. He folded the note. I prefer to think she was born with them. You're not as good at restraint as you think you are, Margaret said. Probably not, he said. Christmas at the Double W was not the Christmas of anyone's most optimistic imaginings, because real Christmases never were. The stove in the main room smoked because of something going wrong in the chimney that Elias spent most of Christmas morning identifying and then fixing with a new damper plate. And the goose Bess had been planning for dinner turned out to have an interior temperature problem that pushed supper back 2 hours, which Rose spent on the floor of the main room with needle and a book Mrs. Aldrich had given her. Gruber came for supper with his wife, a quiet woman named Hattie, who had a dry humor that explained a great deal about Gruber, and Thomas came, and Bess's sister with her husband, and the table was full and loud in the way of tables, where everyone knows each other well enough to argue about things that don't matter. At some point during supper, Rose climbed onto the chair next to Margaret and leaned against her side, not asking for anything, just settling there, the way she settled next to Elias when she was content, and Margaret put an arm around her without making a thing of it, without the self-consciousness that would have been there 5 months ago. Elias watched this from across the table and said nothing. He thought about what it cost a child to learn to trust again after she'd understood that trust was a risk. Rose had understood it early. She'd watched him get turned away from ranches and had learned to keep her hope small, packaged in the moment, not extended forward. She was still careful about it. But Margaret's arm around her shoulders, and Rose's easy lean into it that was not small hope. That was something she'd let grow. He was grateful for it in a way that didn't have language. Some things don't. In January, a letter came from Carew and Selina. The water rights declaration was fully settled in the county record, unchallenged. The Wichita attorney who had represented Pike's men had apparently confirmed to the court that the Double P was withdrawing any informal consideration of a water rights claim against the Double W. Carew's letter was 3 paragraphs, precise and without flourish, and the last line read, "The matter appears resolved in your favor. I expect no further action." Margaret read it at the breakfast table and passed it to Elias, who read it and passed it back. "That's the end of it," she said. "That's the end of that part of it," he said. She looked at him. "Meaning?" "Meaning Pike is still out there and he still wants the water. He's just out of moves that won't cost him more than he can afford." He paused. "But yes. For now this is done," she nodded. She turned the letter face down on the table and looked out the window at the January yard, where the snow was old and gray, and the quality of the light had the particular flat honesty of winter that doesn't pretend to be anything other than what it is. "I want to do something to mark it," she said. He looked at her. "Not a celebration," she said. "I don't mean that. I just mean this ranch nearly didn't survive this year. And it did, and I want to mark that somehow." She was quiet for a moment. "When John and I finished the main house, we planted 2 cottonwood trees at the front gate. Took us a whole afternoon. He said every house should have trees that outlast the people who plant them." "Smart man," Elias said. "The north one died 2 summers ago. Drought." She looked at him. "I want to plant a new one." He understood, though she hadn't said all of it. "When the ground thaws," he said. "When the ground thaws," she agreed. He looked at the letter on the table and thought about a cottonwood tree on a road 4 miles west, the one he'd sat beneath with his daughter and his empty saddlebag, and his complete absence of plan. He thought about what it had meant then and what it meant now, and he thought about the way meaning changes not because the facts change, but because the person carrying them does. He had been a man with nowhere to go, and the shame of that had been the sharpest thing he owned. What he understood now in January, looking at the frost on the window glass, was that the shame had been misplaced, not because circumstances had improved. Circumstances improving didn't retroactively make the shame appropriate, it just buried it. What made it misplaced was simpler. He had done everything he could. He had ridden from ranch to ranch. He had kept Rose fed when he could, and honest with her when he couldn't. He had not quit. The cottonwood tree had not been failure, it had been bottom of a valley. And valleys had the quality that if you kept walking, you eventually came out the other side. He'd come out the other side, so had Rose, so had this ranch. So had Margaret. In her own way, he understood that about her now, that the year before he arrived had also been a valley, and that the ranch's survival had been her survival, and that these things were not separable. The ground thawed in March. He got the cottonwood sapling from a nurseryman in Hayes, who charged him 40 cents and threw in a piece of advice about root depth that he didn't need but listened to politely. He brought it back on a Thursday afternoon and dug the hole at the north gate himself, because digging was the kind of work that required attention without requiring thought, and he found that useful. Margaret came out when he was almost finished. She had her coat on and her hair loose under a plain hat, and she was carrying 2 cups of coffee, which she set on the top rail of the gate while she watched him work. "You could have asked Thomas," she said. "I wanted to do it," he said. She handed him a cup when he climbed out of the hole, and they stood with their coffee and looked at the small tree leaning against the gatepost. Not much to look at, yet saplings never were. "Rose wants to name it," Margaret said. He looked at her. "Name it. She says all important things should have names." "She's not wrong," he said. She suggested Harold, Margaret said, after the nurseryman, which I thought showed a certain practical respect for the chain of custody. He considered this. Harold's a fine name for a cottonwood. Margaret looked at him with the slight brightness she got when she found something genuinely funny. "I thought you'd say that." They set the tree together. He held it plumb while she tamped the first layer of soil, and then they switched, and the work of it was ordinary and specific, and not like anything you would dramatize, and it was exactly right for that reason. The things that lasted were usually like that. Not the grand gesture, not the declared moment, but the ordinary work done alongside someone, the accumulated weight of small things done together over time. When it was in and the soil tamped firm, and the water from the bucket soaked in and gone, they stood back and looked at Harold the cottonwood tree, about 3 feet tall and not entirely straight, leaning 2 degrees east of where he should be. "He's crooked," Margaret said. "He'll straighten out," Elias said. "Give him a season." She looked at the tree for a moment longer, and then she turned and looked at him with the direct, unguarded expression that she only had when she'd decided to stop managing her face, which was not often and which always meant something. "I'm glad I stopped that morning," she said, "on the road." He nodded. "So am I. I didn't do it out of pity," she said, because she wanted him to know it and had apparently decided January was long enough to have waited to say it. "I did it because I saw a man who was exhausted and ashamed, and the shame was wrong. It didn't fit what I could see of him." She paused. "I trusted that reading." "I hope it's held up," he said. "Better than I expected," she said, "and I expected it to hold up quite well." He looked at her, and she was 44 years old and had run a ranch alone and held a rope in a burning barn and written a letter to Gerald Whitmore that was measured and firm and gave away nothing. She was not easy, and she was not simple, and she did not require anyone's protection. What she required was, perhaps, what he required someone to stand next to at the fence in the dark, someone who told the truth without dressing it up, someone who did the work, not to be seen doing it, but because the work mattered. He had been that for her. She had been that for him. They had been figuring that out, both of them, for 5 months, with the patient incrementalism of people who had been wrong before about permanent things and were in no hurry to be wrong again. "Margaret," he said. She waited. "I'd like to court you properly," he said. "If that's something you'd be willing to consider." She looked at him. He held the look. There was no way to say that and then hide from it. "Properly," she said, as if examining the word from all sides. "I'm aware we've been living under the same roof and working alongside each other for the better part of half a year," he said. "I understand that ship may have sailed on the conventional definition." "The ship has sailed," she said. "Then I'll settle for the honest definition," he said, "which is that I'd like for what's been true to be acknowledged." She was quiet for a moment, not hesitating, thinking, which was different, and he knew the difference by now. Then she said, "Yes, I'm willing to consider it." "That's as good a start as any," he said. "It is," she said. She picked up the empty coffee cups from the gate rail and started back toward the house, and then she stopped and looked back at him. "Supper's at 6. Don't be late because you're tending something that can wait until morning." "Yes, ma'am," he said. She went inside. He stood at the gate with Harold the cottonwood, who was still slightly crooked and had a long way to grow, and the Marchlight was doing what Marchlight in Kansas does, cutting low and gold across the flat land, making everything longer than it was, making shadows that reached further than the things casting them. Rose came around the corner of the house at a run, because she ran most places, had since she could walk, and she stopped when she saw him at the gate and changed course toward him with the swerving decisiveness of someone who has spotted a better destination. "Is it in?" she said, looking at the tree. "It's in." She studied Harold with her hands on her hips. "He's crooked. He'll straighten out." She tilted her head, considering. "How do you know?" "Because he's got good ground," Elisa said. "Good water. Enough light." He looked at the small tree, leaning slightly into the east wind. "That's all anything needs. The right conditions and enough time." Rose thought about this with the seriousnesses she brought to all considerations that were partly about trees and partly about something else. She was 8 years old, and she was sharper than most adults he'd known, and she understood subtext the way she understood mathematics, not as something mysterious, but as something with an underlying logic that could be worked out if you paid enough attention. "Are we going to stay here?" she said. He looked at her. She was looking at the tree, not at him, which was how she asked the questions she actually needed answered. "Yes," he said. "We're going to stay here." She nodded once, satisfied, and then looked up at the house where the smoke was coming from Bess's kitchen, and the late light was in the windows. "Good," she said. Needle would hate to move. She turned and ran back toward the house. He watched her go, and then he turned back to the pasture, where Cutter was moving among the mares in the winter grass, and to the rebuilt east wall of the hay barn that was slowly losing its newness, and to the fence lines that were whole and watched, and to the land itself, the flat, specific, demanding land that had nearly been lost and hadn't been, because the people who cared about it had refused to let it go. There was nothing triumphant about it. The winter hay was short because of the barn fire, and they'd be watching the numbers carefully until spring. The east wall would need another coat of weatherproofing before summer. The northeast fence line would need monitoring for as long as the Double P shared its border, because a changed man was not always a reformed one, and Harlan Pike had simply run out of moves, not out of desire. Life on the Double W was not going to become easy. It never had been. Not for John Whitmore who'd built it, not for Margaret who'd held it, and not for Elias who'd chosen it. The land didn't offer ease. It offered ground real, demanding, particular ground, the kind you had to earn every season. That, he had come to understand, was the whole point. A man could look at his life and see what was missing, and spend his days measuring the distance between where he was and where he thought he should be, and that measuring would use up every hour he had. Or a man could look at what was actually in front of him, the real and specific and imperfect thing, and decide that it was worth the full weight of his attention. He'd made that decision under a cottonwood tree in October, without knowing he was making it. He'd simply gotten up from the ground and followed a stranger's carriage down a road, and every day since had been the slow, ordinary, difficult work of making that choice real. He went inside for supper. He was not late.